Hi everyone. Tonight, we're at a Viking longhouse on a night so cold that your breath freezes before you can finish breathing in. Picture it. It's snowing and the snow is crunching under my feet. The cold wind is pushing against the wooden walls. The flames of the fire cast shadows on the smoke-filled rafters. You lie down on a bench covered in animal skins. The first thought that comes to mind is simple. How did anyone survive this? The second thought is even better. You probably wouldn't do it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the time where you are in the comments. It's always interesting to see where in the world people are listening from. Now, turn off the bright lights because this story is going to take you deep into the world of Viking nights. The longhouse itself will keep you warm, but it's not perfect. It is made of thick wood and is covered with turf and mud. It is wide enough for a family and their animals to live in, but the cold gets in through every crack. You lie on the wooden floor and feel the cold air on your face, reminding you that insulation is a modern luxury. Historical sources describe longhouses as smoky, dark, and perpetually damp, but they were also strong against the endless winters of Scandinavia. What you notice first is the smell. Wood smoke hung thick in the rafters, mixed with the smell of wet earth from the turf roof and the strong animal smell of the animals kept in the far end of the building. It leaves a smell that sticks to your skin, hair, and bedding. It's something you have to deal with, whether you like it or not. Experts have found evidence of fires that burned for hundreds of years. You can almost hear the sound of logs being dropped onto hot coals, the crackle of the fire against the silence of the night. This is the most important fact. The Longhouse was the most important building in Viking society. It was up to 70 feet long and had a hearth in the middle. People would have died if they didn't have it, because it's very cold in Scandinavia in winter. But there were some strange details too. For example, some longhouses were so badly ventilated that guests often complained about choking smoke. Try to sleep when it feels like your chest is on fire. Some people even said that the smoke actually kept the roof timbers from rotting by killing any pests that might have otherwise eaten the wood. So, yes, smoke can irritate your lungs, but it was just trying to keep pests away. You lie on your side and listen. The longhouse is full of the sounds of people moving around, the rustle of straw bedding, and the occasional cough or prayer. It's not the quiet of a modern bedroom. It's a living barn. The walls are close together, and you can feel the wind rushing past you. But despite this, there is a feeling of warmth in the community. Scholars are still trying to work out how well these halls actually worked. Some people say that they provided reasonable shelter thanks to turf insulation and tightly laid planks. Others say that sleeping inside is not much warmer than being outside, but there is less wind. Which side is right? People still debate this, but it's clear that Vikings accepted discomfort as just part of life. For them, shivering under furs wasn't a sign of failure. It was just normal, everyday life. Close your eyes and picture the scene. Outside, the northern sky is filled with beautiful swirling patterns of light, known as auroras. But inside the hall, it's dark. You can see the flames, and you can hear the sound of people being squashed together. The fire glows at the center, making everything look a bit orange and smoky. Your fingers go stiff from the cold, but you still like the comfort of fur and family. This was about survival, not luxury. As you drift closer to sleep, you wonder what other tricks these people use to keep the cold at bay. The room around you starts to feel very heavy. A huge wooden structure and turf pressing into the earth. You look closely at the walls. I notice how they are thick, almost smothering, as though the Vikings knew very well that thin planks would never be able to handle the cold. These walls are made of logs, clay, and grass that have been stacked on top of each other to keep the cold out. If you imagine stepping outside into the snowstorm that beats against the Longhouse, the contrast inside is dramatic. It's not warm, but you can survive. This was often the difference between life and death. Digs for old objects in Scandinavia always show the same thing. Longhouses built with turf roofs and earth packed around wooden frames. This wasn't an accident. We can be sure of this because the physical evidence is still there. The roofs sloped low, which helped the snow to pile up and provide insulation. The walls leaned inward, as though the whole house was hunched down against the wind. You can almost feel the weight of snow pressing down on you. But instead of collapsing, the structure got warmer as the snow filled in the gaps. It's a clever way of changing it. You build a roof. The sky provides insulation for free. But living in one was not romantic. The inside was dark, small, and covered in soot from lots of fires. But the way the house was built, with the turf, the logs, and the way it sat in the landscape, meant that families could survive the long, dark Arctic nights. Most people visiting today would probably start to feel cold and cough within an hour. But Vikings liked this idea of comfort. And here's a strange thing about it. There are records of similar turf house designs that have lasted until today in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. In fact, Icelandic farmhouses were still being made with thick layers of turf until the 19th century. Picture a method that was so successful it continued to be used for almost 1,000 years after the Viking Age had finished. It wasn't because I was feeling nostalgic. It was just a practical choice. Now you pull your cloak tighter and notice the texture of the inner walls. They aren't smooth. They bulge where turf and mud were packed in, and they flake where smoke has charred them black. The smell is always there, and it's a bit sour because of the trapped moisture. But that was life. The walls did not just enclose. They breathed in the damp air and let smoke slowly escape through the roof. Did it really keep things warmer than a simple wooden shack? Some experts say that the turf worked like modern insulation. Others say that the benefit was small and that the real warmth came only from the fire itself. You're lying on your bed, still wondering which side is the right one. The sounds around you make the experience feel more real. You can hear the old beams creaking under the weight of the snow, the occasional drip of water where the ice has melted through the roof, and the dull thud of the wind pushing against the turf siding. When there are no windows, all your senses become stronger. You rely on your ears, nose, and skin to tell you what's happening around you when it's dark. The walls aren't just there. They seem to be alive. They creak, they breathe, they shelter, and they are barely keeping back the northern night. It's important to remember that these structures weren't meant to be permanent. A long house could last a generation or two, or even longer if looked after before the wood started to rot or the grass got worn out. But for that time, it gave a family and their animals a chance to survive winters that would otherwise have been impossible. Most experts today agree that the sheer size of these houses, which could be as long as 20 meters, was part of the heating strategy. The more people and animals inside, the more heat is produced. The house kept out the cold and trapped body heat. Here's one of those details that makes you stop and think. Some excavation sites show long houses dug slightly into the ground. This is because the earth itself is a good insulator. Imagine that the walls are not rising from the soil, but sinking into it. The wind is cold and it's blowing just over the roof. The ground is wet and quiet. It's not fancy, but it works. That little design trick might have saved countless lives. But historians don't always agree on how comfortable these houses were. Some people say that long houses were often smoky and cold, and not very comfortable to live in. They think that people survived more because of their fur clothes than because of the buildings. Others argue that there is evidence of carefully planned airflow systems, suggesting that the Vikings knew more about ventilation than we give them credit for. without written instructions. The truth is unclear, and you're left wondering which interpretation is real as you lie under the turf roof, breathing in a mixture of warmth and smoke. Now, as you imagine this Longhouse night, you notice the shared feeling again. The house was always full of people. The thick walls made it feel like a fortress, but it was the people inside who made it a home. The quiet voices of children, the sounds made by animals, and the regular breathing of someone living nearby. All these sounds bounce off the ground and the trees, mixing together to create a lullaby for survival. In a world where snowstorms could wipe out whole villages, the Longhouse felt like a womb, protective and cozy. One thing is clear: the Viking Longhouse was not a place of luxury, but a way of living in harmony with nature. Its design was simple, but had a purpose. It absorbed snow, trapped heat, muffled wind, and sheltered both human and animal life together. You might think it's strange to think about sharing a room with cows and goats, but to the Vikings, it meant having more warmth. As you lie there, you think about how hard it must have been to build such a structure. Chopping down trees with iron axes, moving turf blocks, and getting muddy in the freezing cold. The Longhouse shows that people are strong and do not give up easily. These were the qualities that defined the people themselves. As they built, did they already feel warmer, knowing that every log they raised and every piece of turf they laid would help them get through another year? Outside, the storm rages on, but the thick walls of the building block it out. The Longhouse looks tired. The fire splutters, and your breath mixes with smoke and steam from damp earth. It isn't comfortable. This is not the kind of comfort you are used to. For the Vikings, this was a very important decision. As your eyes close again, you realize how great their compromise is. The idea is not to conquer the cold, but to outlast it. The bright flame in the middle becomes the whole background. It is more than just warmth. It is life itself, the most important thing in the Longhouse. Every Viking night spiraled outward from that blaze, and without it, the hall would fall silent. You stretch out and feel the heat ebb and flow across your skin like the tide. If it's too tight, you'll sweat. If you go too far, your toes will go stiff in the cold. Fire can be unpredictable, kind, and dangerous at the same time. When archaeologists dig at these sites, they often find long lines of burned earth running through the middle of the halls. These are the remains of open hearths. Sometimes they stretch the length of the room, and other times they are broken into sections. That evidence is solid. Fire was a key part of Viking life. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Without that flame, no one in the room would have been able to sleep, eat, or survive. But there's something interesting. Some sagas mention fires being carefully banked with ash at night, so they would smolder until morning. This method kept the embers alive without using up the fuel. You imagine a Viking carefully kneeling, scooping gray ash over a fire, sealing the warmth in like treasure under a blanket of ash. It's like hitting the snooze button on an old alarm clock, making the house glow a little and get ready to be woken up. But living with fire meant living with risk. Logs can be very hot, and if a piece of straw, wool, or cloth comes into contact with them, it can catch fire. If this happens in a house, it could quickly become a very dangerous situation. The smell of scorched fur or singed clothing was probably common. In fact, some experts say that the very long hearths made it more dangerous. The bigger the fire, the more likely it is to become dangerous. But people still live there because they would freeze to death otherwise. As you move around in your bed, you notice that the heat feels uneven. One side of your body feels warm, while the other is cold. You can feel the cold air coming in through the open door. Viking families had to put up with a lot of ups and downs, just like this. If you're too close to a fire, you can't breathe and you might get burned. If you go too far, you pull in your body and push against others just to keep the edge of warmth. Today's scholars don't all agree on how these fires were managed. Some people think there were raised stone borders around it to stop the fire spreading. Others argue that the evidence of flat hearths suggests no barriers, just open flames flickering through the night. It's still unclear, and the lack of preserved stonework in many digs makes it hard to know what really happened. You can imagine it as either a neat, glowing channel or a big pile of embers that are sending out sparks in the dark. You listen to the sounds around the hearth. The wood crackles loudly, with quieter hisses as the sap bursts under the heat. The fire spits, and occasionally a log shifts with a low thud. These noises spread through the Longhouse, mixing with the steady breathing of those lying nearby. The fire heats the body and calms the mind. In a world where nights seem to go on forever, that sound must have been like a lullaby. Most people agree that the fire was the only real source of light inside. Oil lamps or torches might have been used sometimes, but they weren't the most important source of light. Imagine trying to find your way through a busy hall with only a small, bright flame to guide you. Shadows loom and shift, flickering against the walls of the turf. Children wake up and think they are ghosts. In the light of the fire, the difference between the supernatural and the ordinary becomes less clear, and stories are born from these shapes. It's easy to see how stories about ghosts, gods, and heroes could have flourished in that half-lit world. Here's an interesting fact to think about. Some Viking longhouses had more than one hearth. In Greenland, digs revealed big halls with lots of fire pits, which might have been used by different families or for different things. This suggests a space that is shared but also separate, like having many small worlds in one place. You imagine the heat zones overlapping, families huddled around their own glow, each fire a private island in the smoky hall. But of course, the problem with smoking is the smoke itself. In the old designs, there were no chimneys. This meant that smoke rose and got trapped under the roof before finally coming out through the roof. The ceiling of the hall was covered in soot, and the rafters had turned black after just a few winters. Visitors often said that the inside of the Viking ships were too dark and stuffy. Some scholars even think that people slept low to the ground, partly to avoid the smoke that was even worse. It's a strange way to survive. The hearth gives life, but you have to move away from its breath to survive the night. Think about how overwhelming this would be. The heat makes things bigger, the smoke hurts your eyes, and yet the other option is worse. You're lying there crying and coughing, but you are still warm. Was it worth it? Every Viking would have said yes. Some experts say that the fire was more than just a practical thing. It might have been sacred too. The hearth was seen as the heart of the home, with family gods or protective spirits connected to it, feeding the fire and keeping the flames alive. These could have been acts of respect as well as necessity. You imagine a mother quietly praying as she lies on a log, knowing that the flames will keep her children alive until morning. Now imagine the rhythm of a whole night shaped by this glow. The fire goes out. People stir to add wood. The smoke becomes thicker. The hall falls asleep again. The cycle repeats until the sun comes up, and then it finally shines through the cracks in the roof. You never sleep deeply. Not a longhouse. Instead, you're somewhere between being awake and being asleep, and your body is used to the heat of the hearth. And so, as you get closer to that imagined flame, you realize its paradox. It is both a protector and a threat, both comforting and suffocating. Without it, you'd never see another morning. But with it, you pay the price in smoke, danger, and restless nights. But for the Vikings, this was normal. It was the most important thing in their world. The longer you spend in this smoky hall, the more you notice the strange movement of the air. One moment, The smoke drifts lazily upward, curling into the rafters like gray ribbons. The next it goes down, stinging your throat and making your eyes water. You cough, pull your cloak tighter, and realize that air circulation was the hidden design of the Viking Longhouse. If you have too much of it, you will feel very cold. If there is not enough, you will suffocate. There was no perfect balance, just a constant mix of cold air and smoky warmth. Archaeological remains show that there were simple roof vents and gaps in the ridge where smoke could escape. These are not decorative chimneys, but narrow slits, sometimes covered with movable boards or turf that could be adjusted depending on wind and weather. You can almost picture a tired Viking pushing a roof board into place and swearing at the smoke that won't go where he wants it to. The idea was simple but smart. Make sure you create enough suction to pull the smoke up, but don't let any heat escape. But even with these new things, you can still see blackened rafters and soot-covered wood, which tells the story clearly. There was still smoke. It covered surfaces, soaked into clothes, and left every longhouse smelling like an overworked bonfire. Many researchers believe this was more than just a small problem. They think it was a long-term health issue. Imagine breathing that air every night of your life. Your eyes are burning, your lungs are irritated, and you can't sleep well. The walls kept out the wind, but the fire filled your chest with ash. Here's something interesting to think about. Even though it's clear that smoky interiors have their drawbacks, some experts say that there are unexpected benefits to them. The constant haze probably kept insects away, keeping flies and mosquitoes at bay during the warmer months. The smoke may also have stopped bacteria growing in places where food is stored. So, while you were coughing, your supplies lasted longer and your animals stayed healthier. It's a strange trade-off. It's bad for your lungs, but it helps you survive. When you imagine it, you can almost feel the haze. Your skin prickles from the sting in the air. Your hair smells of wood smoke all the time, and you can hear every little wind that blows. Ventilation becomes very important. Which way is the wind blowing? Should you open the smoke hole wider? Would you risk losing heat by turning off your heating? These decisions determine whether the family coughed all night or stayed silent. Experts still can't agree on how well these smoke holes worked. Some people think that they provided enough airflow, especially when combined with cracks in the walls. Others say that they were just a symbol of support and didn't really improve conditions. There is no intact roof system left, so the debate continues in academic circles without answer. You can imagine the tension between them. Heat is escaping, smoke is filling the room, and people are moving restlessly under their blankets, not knowing what to do. And then there's the worrying detail that smoke didn't just rise harmlessly. The soot built up in layers, and some roof beams that have survived are almost completely covered in it. In some places, archaeologists have removed centuries of hardened residue, which is a sad reminder of the many fires that used to burn under the floor. If the walls of those long houses could talk, they would be wreathed in a scowl. But there is another strange benefit. The soot that covered the wood might have made it stronger, protecting it from insects and rotting. What looked like a lot of pollution might have been a way to protect it. You imagine Viking builders nodding with satisfaction, not because they understood chemistry, but because the beams lasted longer than expected. Survival sometimes just happened. Pay more attention to the sounds coming from the smoky hall. You hear a child crying quietly, the sound of a goat coughing in the corner, and the shuffle of a man getting up to check the fire. Every movement stirs up the smoke again, and the rhythm of the night is broken by these small interruptions. There is no restful sleep, only the uncomfortable feeling of bodies adapting to air that always tastes of fire. Some sagas even mention this difficulty, suggesting that characters were reduced to smoke or that they cursed the black mist that clung to the rafters. The language itself keeps the memory of discomfort alive. But people got used to it. Just as people in the city today can ignore the noise of traffic, Vikings probably learned to deal with the smoke, cough, rolling over, and still sleeping. It was the price of warmth. Also think about the psychological side of things. In the soft light, shadows moved across the walls, making the rafters look like giants. The mind, half awake and stinging from smoke, might easily conjure shapes of spirits, ancestors, or wandering gods. Could it be that the smoke made people's minds go wild, helping stories to form in the dark? People who study folklore think this is true. They point out that many Norse myths have images of haze, twilight, and shadows. This means that choking on smoke might also have made people believe in myths. The contradiction is obvious. Ventilation meant making compromises. The smoke hole was a lifeline, but it never worked perfectly. The cold made it so that the roof was closed. The fire made it open. Families do this every night, making adjustments, coughing, and just getting on with it. As you get comfortable in your furs in this imaginary room, you realize you're also involved in that old discussion. Every time I breathe, I am reminded. You have to pay for warmth. Your back aches from the hard planks, so you move a little and find another secret of Viking nights: raised sleeping platforms. These weren't fancy beds with carved decorations or mattresses filled with feathers. They were simple benches built along the Longhouse walls, wide enough for a family to sit or lie across. Sometimes it's just a rough plank or a layer of woven branches with straw on top. But compared to lying directly on the dirt floor, they were a step into comfort and, more importantly, survival. Experts have found evidence of these platforms in dugout rooms, holes in the walls, and areas of soil that have changed color where would used to be. They have also found layers of rotted straw that were once used to build the platforms. Most scholars agree that raised benches were standard features. Sleeping on the ground had two benefits. You stayed away from the cold dampness that came up from the ground, and you avoided getting too close to small animals or pests. It's one of those adaptations that seems obvious when you think about it, but only because people who froze before you learned it the hard way. Now, imagine lying on one of these benches. Your body is lifted a foot or two off the ground, and you immediately feel the cold. The floor is dark, moist, and uneven. Here on the planks, you can feel air moving around instead of mud pressing into your bones. A thin layer of straw makes the wood feel less rough, and animal skins drape across your shoulders like heavy, musky blankets. The difference between shivering through the night and having bad dreams was often down to this simple wooden ledge. Here's something interesting. Some of these benches also had storage space. People put things like belongings, tools, and sometimes even food under the raised beds, making them useful for more than one thing. You might lie down and find the iron axe you sharpened earlier resting just below your head, or your winter root vegetables tucked safely away from nibbling goats. It wasn't luxury, it was efficiency. But how many people sat on these benches? It looks like the answer is as many as can fit. Written descriptions from the sagas and similar stories suggest that whole families sat together, sometimes children between parents, sometimes relatives or servants in the same row. Privacy was seen as something that was very important. In a longhouse, warmth was more important than dignity. Your neighbor's elbow might hit your ribs, or their snoring might shake your head, but their body heat kept you alive. Experts are still arguing about how wide these platforms were. Some of the reconstructions show narrow benches that are hardly larger than modern single beds. Others show long benches that go all the way along the wall, more like shared sofas than single beds. There is not much evidence, so the debate continues. As you lie here in your Imagine Hall, you can picture two different scenarios. Either a small shelf for you to stand on, or a shelf where half the family can stand, with plenty of space for all of you. It's easy to imagine the feeling. You climb up, feel the wood creak beneath your weight, and settle in a straw that scratches your skin but smells faintly sweet. Rafters are growing above the snow. Someone next to you moves, makes a noise in their sleep, and moves closer. You are never truly alone here, never separated from the warmth or noise of other people. One strange discovery at a site in Denmark showed layers of charred straw bedding, which suggests that sometimes these benches caught fire when sparks flew too far. Imagine your mattress catching fire and smoldering beneath you. Did families suddenly shout? Did they just cover it with cloaks and lie back down? Too tired to care? The archaeological scar is very interesting, but it also makes you think about how dangerous life was. With a fireplace in the middle of the room, the benches also had another important role. They made the Longhouse look like a tiered cake. The warmth rose, the smoke hung around, and those on benches found themselves somewhere in the middle. They weren't freezing on the ground or choking at the rafters, but somewhere in between. You might not be breathing perfectly clear air, but you weren't suffocating either. It was a middle ground that was practical and based on the architecture itself. And, as well as their practical purpose, these raised sleeping spots also played a social role. The benches closest to the fire were probably for important people, while less popular corners were left for servants and guests. The sleeping arrangements revealed who was in charge. The way people were positioned showed who had more power. You might think of it as the Viking version of seating charts, but it's actually in place every single night. As you get more comfortable in your bed, you start to feel grateful, but also a bit uncomfortable. You're grateful that you aren't lying in the mud and feeling the cold. You're uncomfortable because you're pressed against your relatives and the straw is itching your skin. The fire is too close for comfort. This was the Viking bed. Rough, smoky, shared, and yet very important. The raised platform is not a luxury suite. But when winter comes and the world freezes solid, it is enough. It's enough to rest and survive. When you close your eyes and see the firelight flicker, you understand that sometimes survival depends not on fighting the cold, but on finding the smallest edge against it. A plank, a layer of straw, a place one step above the earth. You run your fingers over the surface of your bedding and realize that it isn't just rough straw or planks beneath you. There's a layering system in place, and it's a result of the need for it. First comes a layer of dried grass or reeds, which is refreshed as often as families can manage. Then they had woolen blankets, and finally the most precious things of all, thick animal skins. These were the Viking equivalent of duvets, heavy and warm, and they smelled of sheep and reindeer, not lavender. Archaeological digs have revealed traces of bedding material, bits of charred straw, tufts of sheep wool, and even hair from goats that was woven into blankets. These fragments confirm what some sagas sometimes suggest. Wool was the most comfortable material. Scandinavian sheep are strong and thick, and their fleece is perfect for making strong, long-lasting yarn. When spun into blankets or cloaks, wool kept heat in even when it was damp. This made it a miracle fabric long before Gore-Tex existed. You might think it's weird, but your body actually benefits from the warmth. Here's an interesting detail. Not all of the bedding was made in the area. Some furs came from distant trade routes. Bear pelts came from the north, and beaver skins came from the east. We also have luxury reindeer hides from Lapland. It was seen as a sign of status to sleep under such a cover. Imagine lying under a shiny coat that had traveled hundreds of miles, showing that your family was rich or had important friends. Bedding itself became a quiet symbol of status. Now lean closer and feel it with your hands. The straw beneath scratches, the wool above itches, and the furs weigh heavily on your chest. But together, they make a protective covering against the cold wind that gets in through the turf walls. If it wasn't for these layers, the cold would seep in and make your toes and joints numb. With them, you might actually drift into dreams instead of shivering through the night. Experts are still trying to work out exactly how thick these layers of bedding were. Some reconstructions show only a few inches of straw. Others suggest deep piles that are refreshed regularly, almost like primitive mattresses. People still can't agree on whether animal skins were put under or over sleeping mats. Did you lie on fur and cover yourself with wool, or the other way around? The physical evidence doesn't prove it. The debate between scholars continues. You can imagine which one left fewer flea bites. Fleas were the uninvited guests at every Viking sleepover. Wool and fur were warm, but they let pests get in. When archaeologists study Viking burial sites, they often find insect remains in the clothes and bedding. It was clear that itching was a regular part of life at night. You might think it's funny to imagine a soldier who was brave in the cold sea, but who was angry at small animals under his blanket. Survival was never glamorous. And then there's the smell. The wool smelled of linseed, earth, and oil. The musk of the animals they used to wear was still on their fur. The Longhouse was filled with smoke from the fire and dampness from the turf walls, creating a sense of life's raw and unfiltered energy. Did people notice? Or had their senses changed so much that this mix of animal, earth, and ash simply became the smell of home? Scientists who study humans, anthropologists, think this is probably true. They say that humans quickly get used to their surroundings. One lovely detail comes from old stories. Sometimes, bedding was blessed or charmed. People would cover their children with a piece of skin and whisper words to protect them from bad spirits. This suggests that blankets were more than just physical shields. They were also a symbol of spiritual protection. Wrapping yourself in fur made you feel safe. You imagine a mother patting her son's head, quietly saying a prayer to ask for a safe night. Think about the feel of these nights. You move on straw that makes a noise as you go, pull a woolen cloak higher over your chin, and feel the heavy pull of a fur pressing you down. The air feels cold, but your body heat builds under the layers, turning discomfort into something closer to relief. At that moment, survival doesn't feel heroic. It feels ordinary, just another night and another day waiting for the snow to melt. Close your eyes and imagine the simple materials, grass, wool, and hide, that have been used to create a cozy nest. It's amazing to think that these materials were once essential for survival. They didn't have silk sheets or feather beds, but they were smart enough to make do with what they had. But even though it's itchy, there are pests, and it's heavy, you still sleep. In the Viking world, that was enough. The fur on your chest feels heavier than wool, softer than straw, and undeniably foreign. You will notice the difference right away. This isn't from the sheep grazing just outside the Longhouse, or from the goats whose blood fills the night. This pelt has been to many places. Its texture suggests that it once belonged to a beaver, or perhaps even a bear, which are animals that would not usually be found on your farm. This helps us understand more about Viking life. Their bedding was not just a local resource, but part of a much wider web of trade. We have proof from archaeology and old books that Vikings lived with other people. They traveled, raided, traded, and traded goods that changed their homes. People really liked furs. Hides from reindeer and foxes from the northern part of Scandinavia were brought. Merchants brought beaver, sable, and marten skins from the forests of Russia and the Baltic. It was more than just warm to lie under those covers. It was a sign of status. If you owned an imported pelt, it showed that your family was influential and rich enough to buy it. We know for sure that furs were an important part of Viking trade. People from lands that had been conquered often brought gifts like pelts to the north. Merchants from as far as the Middle East wanted to buy these furs because they were rare and kept people warm. In fact, bits of Arabian silver coins found in Scandinavia show that there was trade there. Furs are moving south, while silver is moving north. Some of those furs were used not just for lining cloaks, but also for bedding, making the Viking nights more comfortable. But there's an interesting story too. In the Middle Ages, people sometimes wrote about the Smay trading reindeer hides not just for tools or iron, but for dairy products too. This suggests that people might have bought bedding warmth with buckets of milk or cheese. Picture a Viking farmer carrying a bundle of reindeer hides that he has earned by trading goat cheese and proudly spreading it out on his family's bed. Survival stitched itself together from unexpected bargains. When you press your cheek into one of these imported furs, it feels different from local wool. The fur is sleeker, more supple, and often better at trapping heat. Reindeer hides were famous for their ability to keep out cold, and were even used in modern Arctic expeditions. Picture how happy a Viking child would be if they could crawl under a cover like this. They would feel its weight and warmth. They would be protected from the cold wind that might come through the turf walls. For that child, survival had meant crossing miles of icy wilderness. Scientists are still discussing how often these imported furs were used in everyday homes. Some people say that they were rare luxuries that only rich chieftains and their families had. Others suggest that trade was so big that even poor farmers might sometimes sleep under foreign pelts, at least for special occasions or during the worst winters. There is some evidence, but it is a bit mixed, so we can't be sure. But whether it was rare or not, the meaning of the symbol was important. Furs were seen as a sign of status. They were a clear sign of a connection beyond the village. This shows how far the Vikings traveled. It wasn't just about comfort to lie under an imported pelt. It was a statement, quietly said into the smoky dark. We are part of something bigger than this room. Close your eyes and imagine what it feels like. Now your shoulders sink into the softness. Your body heat is kept in by layers that work better than anything made of wool. You can hear other people snoring around you. They might be jealous of your fur or be feeling comfortable. The fire is flickering, smoke is curling up into the air, and snow is piling up outside. You are wrapped not only in warmth, but also in the long threads of trade, war, and travel that were all part of the Viking Age. This meant that even sleeping became part of a global network. You think of silver coins being traded across the sea, of beaver pelts being exchanged in the forest, of caravans moving quietly through snowy mountain passes. Everything comes to an end here in this Longhouse, where you finally feel relaxed enough to start dreaming, but then feel uneasy. The furs may itch. They may smell a little of musk, but they carry with them the scent of faraway lands. And in the middle of a Scandinavian winter, that was like magic. It could make the difference between being awake and shivering all night. You move to make room for the heavy hides and realize that there is not much space. The Longhouse isn't just a quiet place for one family. It is a hive. The benches along the walls are filled with people. They are not in neat rows, but all mixed together. There are grandparents, parents, children, servants, and sometimes a guest. Everyone was very close to each other. The very way it was built made it necessary for it to be like that. The walls were so thick and there was so little space, so the best way to stay warm was to share the air, the furs, and sometimes even the same blanket. Archaeologists often say that longhouses are very big. Some of these buildings were 20 or 30 meters long. The Vikings weren't trying to make more space for themselves. This was because a lot of families, and sometimes even generations, lived together in one house. It was more like a community building than a house, a small village built into the wooden shell of the building. One surviving saga mentions 3 households sharing the same hall, and you can almost feel the press of bodies as you try to roll over without knocking someone else in the face. The benefits were practical. The extra people meant it was hotter. The bodies were close together, which made them all feel a bit warm. In an age when insulation was poor and fires were not always reliable, this group of people used the heat to survive. You might not have enjoyed sleeping near your grumpy uncle or the servant who hadn't bathed for months, but their body heat might have kept you alive. And there's a strange little story that's been passed down through the years. Some families were said to have arranged their sleeping bags in a special way. They put their children between the adults in the bag so that everyone would be as warm as possible. Imagine being stuck between two snoring parents wrapped in their cloaks while cousins and grandparents stood in a line against the cold air coming in from the door. The Longhouse started to feel more like a blanket than a bedroom. Each body is like a patch sewn into the quilt of survival. But this closeness had a negative effect. Privacy, as you understand it, didn't exist. Every cough, every moan, every restless turn was heard by everyone in the room. If someone started an argument in a quiet voice, everyone would still be able to hear them. Intimacy was never really private, but for the Vikings, this was normal. Today, people might say that it is too controlling. They called it life. Scientists are still trying to work out how these shared spaces affected social dynamics. Did the constant proximity of the two groups strengthen the ties between them, or did it cause ongoing problems? Some experts who study people, called anthropologists, think that living in such small spaces made people work together in new and unusual ways. Families who had to spend all night in each other's company learned to be patient and tolerant. Others say that sagas full of feuds and rivalries hint at the opposite. They say that living stacked together like firewood fueled resentment as much as solidarity. Both views are valid, and you lying on your straw mattress might agree with either, depending on whose elbow just jabbed you in the ribs. Close your eyes now and imagine the sensory storm. The warmth of bodies touching. There are the smells of sweat, wool, and smoke all mixed together. The sound of snoring could be heard all over the hall. Somewhere, a baby is crying. Somewhere else, a dog makes a soft, growling noise in its sleep. This isn't quiet. It's a loud noise. But even in the noise, there's comfort. You are never alone. One interesting thing that was found at the dig. Sometimes benches appear to have been built at slightly different heights, perhaps dividing one family's sleeping area from another's blinding. You might picture shallow ledges going up the wall, with each clan claiming their level. The arrangement made everyone feel warm and cozy, with the bench closest to the fire and the others sitting further away towards the back. The politics of who gets to sleep were as clear as the words spoken at the feast during the day. So, as you imagine this busy hall, you realize something important. The Longhouse wasn't designed for just one person. It was designed for the group. Survival wasn't a lonely process. It was a shared experience with a lot of noise and sometimes discomfort, but it was also very human. You shared not only stories and meals, but also your body heat, night after night, winter after winter. And in that close space with the sweat and smoke and the feeling of being very cramped, there was also a kind of safety. If there was danger, if a storm tore at the roof, if someone got sick, you weren't left alone. You were surrounded, a part of the family. In the Viking world, that closeness might have been the best thing of all. You stir in the smoky dark, and the warmth you feel doesn't just come from your family being close to you. It comes from something bigger and heavier at the far end of the hall. There, behind a wooden partition or a low fence, animals move and breathe in and out, adding to the mist inside the Longhouse. Animals like cows, sheep, goats, and pigs often lived in the same house as their owners. And while it might sound bad today, the Vikings' mixed heating system was actually very practical. Digs show that longhouses are usually divided into different sections. One part of the building is used for living, and the other part is used for animals. These two parts are sometimes separated by a wall that is as tall as a person's waist. The evidence is clear. There are troughs carved into the floor for feeding, holes for pens, and layers of compacted manure still preserved in the soil. It's not guesswork. These halls were also used as barns. When winter came, the animals weren't left outside to freeze. They became roommates, and their breathing made the house a little warmer. Close your eyes and imagine it. The air smelt of hay and manure. You can hear the horses moving restlessly. You can hear a cow breathing on the other side of the wall. At first, it seems unbearable, but then you feel the warmth. It was slow and steady, spreading across the hall as the second half of the game went on. Every animal became a radiator, their bodies contributing to the invisible tide of heat that pulled under the turf roof. One thing we do know is that cows produce a lot of body heat. Modern farmers even calculate this, knowing that a single cow radiates hundreds of watts of energy. If you have a lot of them, they can create a natural heating system. The Vikings may not have measured in watts, but they understood how valuable it was. Livestock were more than just food. They were winter partners, helping people to survive with every breath. Here's an oddly amusing detail. Sagas and folklore sometimes poke fun at the smell of these arrangements, with characters teased for sleeping with cows. The humor suggests that everyone knew it was both necessary and unpleasant. Imagine rolling over in bed, pulling your cloak, a long, loose piece of fabric, across your nose, and muttering under your breath about the neighbor's goat bleeding all night. But when the storm raged outside, you would be grateful for every warm breath drifting across that partition. Even today, experts are still discussing how closely the animal and human parts were linked. Some of the reconstructions show clear barriers with animals pinned neatly away. Others suggest only a symbolic division, meaning that goats could wander dangerously close to your bedding if you weren't careful. The lack of intact interiors makes us wonder about what it was like inside. And you can picture being both orderly and chaotic, but always full of smells and sounds that modern bedrooms would never have. The presence of animals had a big effect on the climate and the rhythm of sleep. You can hear the horses' hooves, the soft sound of them eating hay, and the snorts and sighs of animals getting ready for bed. Children may have found comfort in these sounds because they reminded them of the heartbeat-like rhythm of cows settling down at night. Adults, on the other hand, might curse when a restless sheep startled awake and bleed loudly at midnight. Either way, there was never total silence when I was trying to sleep. Some researchers even think that the manure on the far side of the hall might have released a little heat as it rotted. You might think it's funny to think about a Viking home heated by dung, but it does make the house feel warm. Did you notice it, or was it just a smell? The debate continues, and you're still wondering if those stinking piles actually helped keep children's toes from freezing. The livestock brought another kind of security as well as warmth. Keeping your animals inside will protect them from predators and theft. In a world where a family's wealth was measured in cows and sheep, it was vital to guard them overnight. You and your goats had to breathe the same smoky air, not because it was fun, but because it was a matter of survival for both of you. As you settle deeper into your furs in this imagined longhouse, the warmth around you is like a layered and complex blanket. There's a fire at the center. Families sit on the benches and breathe heavily. At the far end, animals exhale steadily. The whole hall becomes like one big ecosystem where everyone shares the heat. You might not like the strong smell, but you'll also feel relaxed. In the cold north, every warm breath is important, no matter who or what it comes from. The night goes on, and you notice something interesting. No one here expects to sleep for 8 hours without being woken up. That idea is more characteristic of modern clocks than of the Viking world. In the Longhouse, rest was often in short bursts, as people rose and lay back down according to the fire, chores, and the rhythm of life. You stir at midnight, see someone poking at the embers, hear someone else going to the toilet outside, and it suddenly hits you. People shared a bed, but went to bed at different times. Historical records and studies of different cultures suggest that sleep was often broken up before the Industrial Revolution. People slept for a few hours, woke up in the night, and then had a second sleep before sunrise. Some experts think that the Vikings probably did the same. After all, looking after the home needed it. The fire needed to be fed, smoke holes adjusted, animals checked. During the long, dark Scandinavian winter, it was important to wake up at regular times to survive. Picture it now. Around you, half the hall snores while a few shadowy figures move quietly through the haze. One kneels at the fire and puts a log on the embers. Another leads a goat outside, muttering into the cold. A third just sits, looking up at the sky, thinking or praying. You don't have to sleep here. It's fluid, like a tide ebbing and flowing through the night. One thing we do know is that stories sometimes talk about midnight as if the characters would be expected to be awake for a while in the dark. Some stories even mention conversations or reflections taking place in the middle of the night. These are not treated as interruptions, but as natural pauses in the rhythm of rest. For the Viking family, nighttime was not just a time when everyone was asleep. It was a time when everyone was doing different things, from dozing to waking to tending to the fire and dreaming. Then there's a strange picture. A child wakes up in the dark and asks their mom or dad to tell them a story before they go back to sleep. The stories might have started when some people were awake and others were asleep, as the stories were told over the sound of fire. What better time to tell stories about gods and heroes than in the quiet time between going to sleep and waking up? People who study this topic often disagree about how often this practice was used. Some people say that sleeping in different parts of the house was normal before we had electric lights, but others say that there is not much evidence for this. Did the Vikings follow this rhythm every night or only in winter when it was always dark? The truth is probably somewhere between these two ideas, but the way people have always taken care of their fires and animals suggests that there's a good chance this is true. Now, imagine you're waking up from a dream. Your body is warm under furs, but your lungs hurt from the smoke. You cough, sit up, and see someone else who is already awake. It's comforting to know that you're not facing the night alone. You put another log on the fire, maybe say a few words to a god or ancestor, then relax and wait for sleep to come on. This meant that Viking nights were not silent, but full of life. The sound of wood on fire, the creaks of benches as someone moved, and the sighs of animals rising and settling again. Even going outside for a break in the cold felt like a change. Your eyes saw the bright lights of the northern lights before you went back inside. These interruptions became a part of my memory, making each night feel more like a piece of a woven fabric than a blank page. Think for a moment about how this changed the experience of time. In a Longhouse, the dark was not something you had to put up with, but something you could paint on. People moved in and out of being awake and asleep like fish in a current. Maybe that's why the Vikings measured their days less by minutes and more by tasks. Feed the animals, light the fire, share a story, and drift to sleep again. You get used to that routine. First sleep, waking moments, second sleep. You breathe with the hall rising and falling with its pulse. The idea of having a good, private, quiet night is disappearing. A new tide has replaced it. It is a cycle of warmth, awareness, and dreams that are broken but still feel whole. It is getting later and later, and even though your body is resting, your ears are still awake. In this very noisy Longhouse, silence is rare. Instead, the air is full of sounds from people and animals, all mixed together and echoing through the smoke. You hear it all: songs, quiet voices, snores, the sound of wood moving, the cough of someone whose lungs are filled with soot. For a Viking, this was the sound they needed to sleep. Archaeologists can't dig up sound, but we can find clues in sagas and similar stories. Imagine that after dinner, as families settled down, someone might say a verse or a story, letting the words drift into the dark. These weren't formal performances. They were bedtime habits, ways of filling the hours before the first wave of sleep. In a chieftain's hall, you might hear stories about Odin, Thor, or local heroes. In a farmer's house, you might hear lullabies being sung to calm restless children. In any case, stories and songs were a big part of the night, as much a part of it as the straw beneath your back. But once the voices stopped, another sound could be heard: snoring. Picture lots of people squashed together on benches, cloaks pulled tight, airways full of smoke and fatigue. The noise must have been incredible. Some ethnographers studying traditional farmhouses in Scandinavia describe them as barns of sound where no one ever truly slept in silence. You lie there now, between relatives, and the loud snoring makes your ear vibrate as much as the storm outside. Here's something interesting to think about. Some sagas even make jokes about loud sleepers. People make fun of the characters for the loud noises they make at night, as if everyone in the hall is in trouble too. Humor is still around because it was so common. Everyone was tired, and there was not much air moving around. This meant that snoring was unavoidable. Imagine being annoyed by your neighbor's noisy coughing while knowing you did the same when you fell asleep. And then there were the animals. Cows are moving around in their stalls, goats are bleating gently, and pigs are grunting in their sleep. Every noise was made louder by the echoing timber shell. Some scholars think that the constant noise of the animals was comforting. They believe that it showed that the animals, the family's money, and their lives were safe for the night. Others say it was frustrating, like living in a barn, but feeling like you were living in a house. Both views are valid, depending on what you can accept. Now think about the fire again. As the trees caught fire, they crackled and hissed, sending sparks flying into the dark. The hearth was noisy, a restless companion that never let the room be completely quiet. Sometimes the movement of the logs would wake a person who was just about to fall asleep, and this would also wake up others. The sound of the music spread through the hall, keeping night awake. Many people today think of sleep as a private, peaceful experience, but for Vikings, it was very different. Sleep was a social activity. You slept in a world of sounds, made up of every voice, every cough, and every breath of an animal. Privacy was a dream that was drowned out by the constant noise of life that was packed into the wooden walls. Did people find it tiring? Or, having never known silence, did they drift into slumber easily, their minds soothed by the sound they were used to? One thing is certain: sagas often describe evenings filled with conversation. Heroes boast, women sing, children listen. This suggests that noise wasn't only tolerated, it was expected. It's just part and parcel of everyday life at home. The change from stories being told to people snoring was very easy to hear. It was like there was a continuous flow of voices from when people were awake to when they were asleep. You might smile at the idea that the same lungs which sang praises to Thor an hour ago now rumbled like a bull in slumber. Experts are still talking about how these sounds, which are always there, have had an effect on the culture. Some people say it made people stronger. If you can sleep through goats bleating and uncles snoring, you can endure anything. Others say it made storytelling traditions better. The community spent a lot of time awake in the dark, and stories became an important part of who they were. The evidence can be interpreted in more than one way. As you listen in the Longhouse, you realize that both are true. Now imagine a chorus of sounds around you. The rhythm of breathing, the sound of a creek, the occasional cry of a child, the deep bass of a cow settling down. All these sounds together make a lullaby. It might be a bit rough, but it's comforting because it's familiar. You understand that for a Viking, sleep wasn't about escaping from the world. It was getting lost in it, going there every night and letting the noisy, smoky, beating heart of the Longhouse take over. Time seems to go slowly, and you realize that warmth isn't just about fire, furs, or people being close together. It also comes from what you eat before you lie down. The Viking diet was made up of lots of grains, meat, and dairy, all dense foods that make your body work harder. Eating porridge or roasted mutton fills you up and gives you energy that lasts all night. If you didn't have it, you'd still feel the cold, even if you were wearing a thick reindeer hide coat. Archaeological studies of Viking latrines, outdoor toilets, and rubbish heaps show what the Vikings ate during the winter. The Vikings ate barley and rye bread, thick soups made from peas and beans, stews of lamb or pork, and dairy product from cows and goats. These foods were more than just a way to get the nutrients we needed. They were like insulation, but you could eat them. You can almost taste a bowl of barley porridge sweetened with honey. It feels heavy in your stomach and warms you as you curl up on your bed. Here's an interesting fact. Sometimes, when archaeologists dig up old bones at Viking sites, they find marks that show the Vikings thought marrow was a special treat to eat at night. Picture a child crunching on a roasted bone before bed, then with greasy fingers tucked into furs. It's not fancy, but it's useful. The fat provided a lot of calories, keeping us warm even after the fire had gone out. Researchers are still trying to work out how these foods were distributed so evenly. Did richer families eat more meat, while poorer households ate less meat and more grains and soups? The evidence suggests there is a difference. Some graves contain evidence of a diet rich in animal protein, while others show signs of a plant-based diet. This means that one family might have been well-fed and warm when they went to sleep, while another family might have been hungry and cold in the same village. The effect of what you eat on how well you sleep is something you can feel as you imagine yourself here. When you're full, your body feels relaxed, your limbs feel heavy, and you feel a nice warm feeling inside. If you don't have any food, the cold feels much worse, and every little bit of wind feels like a sharp pinch. It's no wonder that winter feasts, often timed around Yule, were such important events. They weren't just about having fun. They were a way to survive when food was scarce. Picture this. After a hearty stew has been simmering all evening in the central hearth, families sit down on their benches, feeling full and warm. The smoky Longhouse may still be cold, but their inner fires glow. Even the animals benefit from the hay and scraps they are given, as their own bellies produce warmth, which adds to the hall's overall heat. You will find it easier to sleep when you are not hungry. Another interesting detail comes from the history of the sagas. Heroes are sometimes said to eat very big meals before they rest. It's as if having a huge appetite is a sign of strength. One story is about a man who eats a lot of meat and then falls asleep. Was it an exaggeration? Most likely. But it shows that in the past, if you wanted to eat well, you also needed to sleep well. And if you slept well, it was a sign that you were healthy and full of energy. But historians still disagree about whether diet made the cold less bad. Some people think that food with a lot of calories was very important in the Arctic because it kept people warm. Others suggest that while diet played a role, clothing and bedding mattered far more. They point out that even the best-fed body couldn't withstand icy drafts without wool and fur. The debate is still going on, and you have to think about both points while eating your imaginary barley loaf. The image in my mind is very clear. You can still taste the smoky stew long after you've finished eating it. The heaviness in your stomach. The way the heat spreads from the body to the fingertips. You curl up in your blankets, move against your neighbor, and sigh. Tonight, food is as much a blanket as the hides pulled over your shoulders. In the Viking world, survival wasn't just about what covered you. It was about what made you happy. As the night goes on, you understand that every mouthful of stew, every sip of milk, and every piece of marrow was a part of the warmth, a part of the Longhouse, just like the logs and turf. Your belly is heavy from eating that smoky stew. And now someone gives you a horn full of ale. The warmth of food is one thing, but the warmth of drink is another. Vikings made beer, ale, and mead. These weren't just for special meals. They got used to the daily routine, even to struggle to keep warm at night. One swallow makes your cheeks go red. You feel a bit hot. For a moment, you feel as though the cold has gone. Archaeological finds like brewing vats, fermentation pits, and residue on clay vessels show that alcohol was a regular part of Viking homes. People used to make beer by brewing barley or oats with herbs. Mead, a honey wine with a long history, was rare but very popular. These drinks were high in calories, slightly intoxicating, and most importantly, they kept you warm. The feeling of warmth, although short-lived, was enough to help families fall asleep under their smoky roofs. But there's something strange about it, and you can still sense it now. Alcohol makes your blood vessels widen, which makes you feel warm on the outside, but it also makes you lose heat faster. Modern medicine says that drinking alcohol before going to bed in a very cold room can be dangerous. Did the Vikings know this? They probably didn't call it a scientific effect, but they must have noticed the effects. Some people sweat more when they are awake, while others shiver more after they have drunk alcohol. But on cold nights, it was more important to be comfortable straight away than to think about what might happen later. One charming story comes from sagas where men, after drinking too much, fell asleep in strange places, sometimes on benches, sometimes even near the fire. Imagine being woken up at midnight to get a drunken uncle away from the flames before his cloak catches fire. The fact that the story is humorous suggests that this happened often enough to be worth retelling. But alcohol wasn't just about enjoying yourself. These drinks were full of calories, which were important when you needed all the energy you could get. A horn of ale could fill you up like a small meal, keeping you warm. The honey was sweet and heavy, almost like syrup, and it gave the body a quick burst of energy. You imagine lying down after having a drink, feeling warm all over, and your dreams coming quicker. Scientists still disagree about how much alcohol people drank every night. Some people say that ale was the drink of choice, replacing water that was often not clean. Others say that brewing needed grain and honey, both of which were valuable, so families may have carefully planned how much they used, which is true. The archaeological record suggests that both of these were possible. There were feasting halls where mead flowed freely and small farms where ale was precious. Just a little goes a long way on winter nights. The sensory experience is strong. The taste of fermented barley on your tongue. The sweetness of honey lasts on your lips. You feel a little dizzy as you lean back against your soft, warm blankets. Look around you. Voices get louder. Laughter starts up, then gradually dies down into the sound of snoring. The alcohol makes the noisy hall feel less intense and makes the crowds and smoke seem less uncomfortable. But there were still risks. If you had had too much to drink, you might oversleep your turn at tending the fire. Even worse, you might stumble into the animal stalls or collapse dangerously close to the hearth. There are old stories that warn people not to drink too much before they go to bed. These stories were made to remind people that if they do too much drinking, something bad might happen. So, as you sit down under your cloak, feeling warm from the stew and from me, you understand the two sides of Viking drinking. It made you feel good, kept you going, and helped you sleep, but it also made you feel unsafe in the coldest nights. You drift into dreams, cheeks red, stomach full, thinking that survival sometimes tastes like barley and honey, both sharp and sweet. Your head still feels a little dizzy from that kiss, but as you turn onto your side, you notice something simple and revealing. The woolen cloak you wore during the day is not folded neatly away. It is now lying across you like a blanket. In the Viking world, clothes were much more than just clothes. They kept them warm in the cold, both during the day and at night. When the fire went out and the Longhouse shook with the weight of snow, cloaks and tunics were used as bedding. There are lots of textiles in the archaeological record. People have found bits of woolly cloth in graves and bogs all over Scandinavia, and often these bits are surprisingly well preserved. Thick twill weaves, tablet woven bands, and coarse homespun cloth show that wool was very important in everyday life. Sheep were very important for survival. This was because of the meat and milk, but also because of the fleece that could be spun into useful fabric. Historians all agree on this. Viking nights would have been much harsher without wool. Wool had a special, magical quality. Its fibers trap heat even when damp. It was really useful in a place where snow melted into every crack and clothes often got wet. Imagine pulling your day cloak tighter over your body. Its rough texture scratches, but also keeps in the heat. These cloaks weren't used for decoration, like they were in later medieval fashions. They were practical pieces of fabric pinned at the shoulder. They were heavy enough to stop the wind from getting in and thick enough to use as a blanket inside. There's an interesting side note here. In some graves, especially of high-status individuals, cloaks were found lined with imported furs. This suggests a layering system even in clothing. Wool on the outside for durability, fur on the inside for insulation. Sleeping under this cloak meant you were wrapped in both local craft and global trade. This shows that fashion and survival were closely linked in the past. You imagine yourself wearing this cloak, the scratchy wool against your chin, the warm fur lining against your skin. But what about ordinary people? Were farmers and thieves really able to enjoy such a luxury? Scientists are still discussing how the quality of clothing was distributed. Some people think that wool cloaks were worn by everyone, although they were not all the same. Others say that the best fabrics were for the rich, while the poor slept under thinner, rougher materials, using straw or skins to keep warm. The evidence doesn't fully resolve this, leaving you to imagine the range, from rich chieftains wrapped up warm in layers of cloaks to servants shivering in thin, threadbare wraps. People often wore cloaks, tunics, and trousers for the whole night. The idea of changing into night clothes was not something that was done. Instead, people started wearing their day clothes as sleepwear so they could keep warm. Archaeological textile finds show heavy wool tunics, sometimes belted, sometimes simple pullovers, which would have doubled as pajamas, whether that was the intention or not. Imagine sleeping fully dressed with your boots off, but everything else covered. This is both a way to keep the cold at bay and a bit more comfortable. One interesting piece of folklore says that women sometimes spread their shawls or headscarves over children as extra layers. Imagine a mother taking her headscarf off at night and putting it across her toddler like a blanket. These improvisations make you think about how survival wasn't about having a comfortable life. The idea was to use every piece of fabric you could find. Now close your eyes and think about how you feel. The wool scratches your neck and feels heavy on your chest. There's a faint smell of linseed oil. Your tunic itches against your arms, but it is warm. The cloak above you stops the cold wind from getting in through the holes in the turf walls, and for a while you breathe more easily, happy to feel the warm, woolly sheepskin. The social meaning of cloaks also remained in the dark. A cloak was a gift that showed protection, status, and intimacy. Sagas sometimes describe warriors giving cloaks to their friends. These cloaks were more than just fabric. They were symbols of friendship and loyalty. In a longhouse setting, that same cloak might later be used as bedding, showing how it can be used to represent different things like loyalty, survival, and warmth. You wonder if someone lying beside you once wore their cloak in battle, and now it covers you in slumber. Historians are still trying to work out how often people used to wash their clothes. There is some evidence that wool was rarely used in the past because it kept oil from the skin that stopped water and dirt from sticking to it. That means the cloak warming you at night might smell strongly of smoke, sweat, and linseed oil. But the Vikings knew all about that, and it made them feel relaxed. The smell wasn't bad. It was home. Survival was everything. Also think about how often you can reuse something. The same cloak could be used at a feast during the day and as a blanket at night. Fabric was never wasted. It was too valuable. Even worn threadbare pieces found new uses as padding, patches, or stuffing for bedding. Everyone did their bit to keep warm every night. The image becomes clear. The Viking Longhouse wasn't full of blankets that had been specially made for a reason. It was filled with clothes made of special material that could be used for many things and moved smoothly. During the day, they would wear a cloak pinned at the shoulder, and at night, they would unpin it and lay it across their chest. A tunic that smelt of sweat and smoke kept you alive when the fire got smaller. The line between clothing and bedding became less clear and then disappeared. You settled deeper, the wool pressing down, the fur edges brushing your chin. When you think of luxury, you think of endurance. Each thread tells a story of sheep grazing in summer fields, of women spinning by the light of a fire, of looms creaking in smoky rooms. Every thread is about survival. As you drift off to sleep, you realize that in the Viking world, warmth didn't come from clean, tucked-in bed sheets. It came from the clothes you wore all the time, day and night, to keep you warm. You blink, wake up, and feel a warm body pressed against your side. It wasn't an accident. In the Viking world, children were often placed in the middle of the bed. This was both for comfort and to help them survive. The smallest birds, the ones most at risk from the cold, were protected by adults, with lots of layers of warm feathers on either side. It was like having central heating in a house, keeping the kids close to each other like coals kept alive by the fire of family. Excavations of Viking graves where children are sometimes found buried alongside adults with the same types of bedding goods show that this was common at the time. It wasn't just a symbol. It was the same as how they had slept in real life, joined together, kept warm by the heat of older, stronger bodies. Archaeologists can read the soil stains of rotted wood and fur to see the layout. Benches that are wide enough for a few people to sleep with smaller versions of the bench between them. It shows not privacy, but survival through proximity. Close your eyes and imagine it now. Your child curls up on your chest, their hair smelling of smoke and wool, and their little hands are tucked under your cloak. On the other side, another child leans against your partner, legs pressed against yours. The adults form a protective layer around themselves, stopping the wind from blowing through. Any parent today would recognize the instinct to keep little ones close, but here it was even stronger because of the situation. Without that protection, a child might not last the night. One piece of evidence that supports this idea comes from the saga literature, which sometimes hints at children, sometimes sharing a bed with their parents. These accounts are rare and indirect, but they support the archaeological evidence. The Vikings knew that the cold was very cold, and they made things harder for themselves by living in very close together. And then there's the unusual influence of later Scandinavian folk practices. In some places, children were said to sleep crosswise, lying at a right angle to the adults, so that many small bodies could fit into one bench. Picture a group of people all squashed together like a row of adults, with children standing across them. It sounds chaotic, but it made the wooden platform feel warm and cozy. Historians don't all think the same about how organized this practice was. Some people say that stories and traditional practices show that families have always used the middle child method. Others say that it may have varied a lot, with some households practicing more separation, especially if benches were wide. The evidence is unclear, and people are still discussing it in academic meetings. But in the smoky, long house, with air moving under the turf walls, it seems clear what to do. You can still feel it now. It's colder when people are all packed in together. Now, think about how you feel. Children drifting into sleep, feeling safe and warm in the family home. Adults can relax knowing that their children are protected not just by furs, but by people too. In a world where many children died when they were young, this kind of closeness every night must have made them feel very safe. But comfort didn't make the discomfort go away. You move under your cloak, and a child's knee hits your ribs. Another throws their sleep over you, smacking your nose. The benches were narrow, the space was crowded, and there was always noise from elbows and snoring. But parents accepted it because the alternative, letting a child sleep at the edge and get cold, was not an option. One strange discovery at a burial site in Norway showed that a child had been buried with a small fur blanket that had been folded carefully. Was it a symbol of something? Was it a picture of the family's nightly routine of covering children more tightly? We can't be sure, but it seems that bedding for the young was very important for both practical and spiritual reasons. Keeping a child warm was very important because it kept the family alive. The sensory experience becomes stronger as you imagine yourself there. You feel the weight of furs pressing down, the twitching warmth of a child's body against yours, and the steady exhalations creating a small pocket of shared breath under the covers. It can feel claustrophobic, sweaty, and smelly, but it's also cozy and comforting. It's like a blanket against the cold, dark outside. These arrangements help families to get closer. At that time, the idea of having a separate room for children or a nursery wasn't common. Sleep was something they shared, and this made their love and dependence grow, but also made them more aware of how fragile life is. You can imagine a parent lying awake, hand on a child's chest, feeling their breathing, and quietly asking the gods that everyone would be alive in the morning. Experts still debate whether the practice of parents sharing a bed with their children had an impact on how they raised their kids. Some experts who study people say that this made families and relatives closer. They think that this was because everyone was together at night. Others say that it might have caused tension because people were tired and angry. The architecture made people feel close together, and the cold made this feeling even stronger. Now imagine this. The bench breaks when your family sits on it together. Children move restlessly. Adults adjust their cloaks, and the fire hisses as someone stirs it awake. For a moment, the flames light up faces in the pile. They're flushed, sweaty, exhausted, but still alive. That's what Viking nights were like. They weren't peaceful escapes from hard times. They were battles fought with passion, bodies, and strong feelings, every single evening until morning. As your eyes close again in this imagined hall, you accept the discomfort because you understand why it is there. Children are in the middle and adults are on the edge. It's a pattern of survival, a pattern that is written into benches and bedding every night. When morning comes and it's still frosty outside, you'll know that huddling together made all the difference. The Longhouse is restless again, but this time the sounds are quieter. There are murmurs, quiet laughs, and the sound of cloaks being drawn tighter. You realize that intimacy was actually a big part of surviving cold nights. Love and marriage in the Viking Age were not just social arrangements. They were nightly contracts of warmth. When you lie next to a partner, it's not just about having someone to share the experience with. It's also about keeping warm and cozy against the cold. Archaeological finds don't keep affection alive, but they do show us graves where couples were buried with things like bedding, clothes, or furs draped over them. This material evidence, along with references to saga, suggests that sleep and partnership were connected. Marriage wasn't just about family or getting property. In the middle of winter, it was about having someone to press against when the fire got low. You pull your imaginary cloak tighter and feel the warmth of another body next to yours. It was less cold in a hall where you couldn't really be alone. Couples cuddled intimately, whispering in each other's ears under their furs. Was it comfortable? Maybe it wasn't the children snoring nearby, the goats in their pen, the smoke stinging my eyes, but it was the only bit of comfort I could find. One well-known detail from saga literature is the focus on the marriage bed as a place where agreements are made and alliances are formed. The Icelandic sagas sometimes mention who shared beds with who, not just in the literal sense, but in the sense of honor and household order. That placement was important. It decided who was allowed to sit by the fire and who was made to stand at the coldest parts. Here's a fun fact. In some traditions, the wedding ceremony itself involved leading the bride to the marital bench inside the Longhouse rather than to a separate room. Imagine the whole family watching as the new couple's sleeping place was set up, with everyone knowing that the same bench would later become their blanket when it got cold. Romance wasn't the point. It was practical survival. Experts still disagree about how private Viking couples could really be. Some people say that because there were so many people, there was not much chance to be alone, and that being close to other people was a big part of daily life. Others say that having partitions or hangings or animal skins strung along beams might have offered a little separation. The truth was probably different in each place, with some halls having small spaces where couples could be alone, while in others, family members could see and hear them. It's easy to imagine what it looks like. You and your partner hold each other close, sharing warmth and breath. Your cloaks overlap, your limbs tangle, and between snores and coughs, you whisper words that no one else hears. Life goes on around you in the Longhouse. But in this cocoon, you create a pocket of heat, both physical and emotional. Even when things are tough, there's a softness and gentleness present. Imagine a farmer putting his rough wool cloak over his wife and himself, making sure she is covered before he closes his eyes. Or imagine a woman pulling her coat closer around her husband after he has stirred the fire, as a reward for his careful watching. These small acts of kindness, which happened every night, were as important as any big deed in a story because they helped the family get through hard times. But intimacy wasn't just for spouses. In households where widows, widowers, or unmarried adults lived, bed sharing often went beyond just being romantic. Sleeping close to someone could mean that you were more like a family member or more closely responsible for them. An old grandmother might sleep next to her granddaughter, not just because they are close, but also because the body heat of the grandmother helps the granddaughter to stay alive. A servant might be folded into the same bench as children, filling gaps in the wall of warmth. The arrangement made it unclear who was responsible for what, and it showed that working together was more important than being polite. One strange story in old Christian books criticizes people from the north. Some religious leaders complained that they lie in their huts with no separation of men and women. While this may be an overstatement, such comments suggest a reality that shocked people from outside the group. Vikings weren't shy about physical intimacy, and they weren't afraid to show it. You could hear it, see it, and it was part of the experience for everyone in the hall. For the Vikings, this lack of seclusion may have made them stronger. Couples learned to treasure quiet moments, to find warmth not in isolation, but in the bustle of communal life. Love had to exist alongside the sight of goats bleating and children moving restlessly nearby. Maybe that made it more long-lasting, less dependent on the setting, and more focused on presence. Even today, experts are still trying to work out how this environment influenced Viking ideas about marriage and family. Did the constant visibility make people loyal and honest, or jealous and tense? The sagas show us a little bit of both. Stories of couples who were very much in love with each other and who survived difficult times together were told in the same smoky, dark place. The confusion fits perfectly because the Longhouse was both a place to live and a pressure cooker, making every connection and every break in the house even stronger. Now imagine you're lying there, covered in cloaks that are layered on top of each other, the weight of furs pressing you close together, the smoke making your eyes prickle, children coughing nearby, but your partner's hand touches yours, and for a moment you don't feel the cold. In this world, true intimacy is about more than just roses and candlelight. It's about the warmth of shared moments, the quiet intimacy of whispered conversations, and the unshakable connection that holds us through the night. This is what love looked like in the Viking Longhouse. It's not about big actions, but the simple act of gathering together to stay warm, using our bodies to block the cold air, and finding a sense of community in the dim, smoky room. Survival was a shared experience. But even so, couples still created their own small, fragile, personal space where they felt safe. The fire has gone out again, and you move on the bench, feeling the prickly straw under you. That's when you notice another nightly ritual that mattered more than anyone admitted: refreshing the bedding itself. Stromatres warranty permanent. They were renewed, fluffed up, and sometimes replaced completely. If you don't put effort into it, the material under your back will rot, flatten, and be eaten by insects. Keeping straw fresh wasn't just about comfort. It was about hygiene, survival, and showing off to other people. Digs have found thick layers of straw mixed with ash and bits of animal hair in the floors of longhouses. These are the remains of bedding spread in layers and refreshed every season. Straw, which was insulated against the damp earth, provided a little cushioning and absorbed some of the smoke and grease of daily life. But it had to be changed. If you leave it for too long, it will get really dirty and disgusting. Picture lying on straw that's so old it stinks, is damp with sweat and spilled meat that would make it hard to sleep. One reliable point from medieval sources outside Scandinavia is the phrase "shake down the bed." This meant making the straw bedding fluffy, shaking it out, and layering in fresh stalks. Viking households probably did the same, just not with as much formality. You imagine a woman in late autumn bringing in straw, spreading it on the benches, and laughing a little because by spring the stalks would be brown and broken. Here's something interesting. In some northern traditions that have lasted well into the modern era, fresh straw was put on the beds at midwinter festivals. It wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of new beginnings. At Yule, lying on new straw in the new year was a way of welcoming the changing seasons and hoping for good luck. It was also a way of making sure that the next few months of sleep were comfortable. Was this custom Viking? Scholars can't prove it, but there are some intriguing signs that suggest it might be true. Now, let your senses take over. You roll across straw that is stiff and crinkly, and it pokes your arms. There was a slight sweet smell of dry grass, mixed with a stronger smell of furs. Fresh straw is really comfortable. It has an earthy, rustic smell, which is much better than the sour smell of old bedding. It rustles when you move, almost like a whisper in the dark. It's a small reminder that you're sleeping on the same material as your animals chew. But even with this care, the straw only lasted a short time. Families probably replaced it many times a year whenever there were too many bugs. Experts have found layers of ash that have been scattered in the areas where the ash beds are. This was probably done to kill pests or to dry out dampness. Picture this. You sprinkle ashes from the fireplace onto your bed, then add new straw. It's a strange kind of housekeeping that makes the line between dirt and cleanliness disappear. Experts are still discussing whether straw bedding was used in all longhouses, or if richer households used other materials like down or imported textiles. Some of the burials include feathers and jewels, suggesting that some of the people were quite wealthy. But most people ate straw as their main food. It was cheap, there was plenty of it, and it was comfortable for a while. Think of it as the mattress of the people, one that scratched and rustled, but kept you off the bare wood. Refreshing straw was also a way of keeping a steady rhythm in everyday life at home. Children might be asked to bring in bundles, servants to spread them out evenly, and elders to shake out cloaks before putting them back on. Every part of the process was done together, which was another reminder that survival was never a solo endeavor. Keeping the beds clean was as important as tending the fire or feeding the animals. If you don't take care of it, everyone will start to itch, cough, and complain. Picture what it was like to hear the straw when it was new. Families settled in. The noise of people lying down, making a loud noise in the hall. It would become quiet over the weeks, until only silence and dust remained, until new bundles arrived and the noise of rustling sleep filled the night again. Even though it was small, that rhythm was how they measured time, connecting daily life to the changing seasons. Another strange layer. Pests were always a problem. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs all like straw bedding. In fact, scientists studying insects found in Viking graves have shown that fleas were common in those days. You wriggle now, imagining a Viking being thrown under furs, not from the cold, but from bites all over his body. Straw refreshed the bed. Yes, but it never solved the problem. The fight against pests was never-ending. You roll onto your side, noticing the mixture beneath you. The stalks are fresh and crackling. Ashes are drying and insects are waiting for darkness. It's not perfect, but it's better than the other option. If you lie directly on planks or soil, you will feel even colder and more uncomfortable. Straw was never glamorous, but it was enough to help them survive. This nightly routine, including cleaning the straw, spreading out the furs, and shaking out the cloaks, was as important as eating or praying. It was the small, ongoing effort of keeping things livable inside a smoky hall. You might feel itchy and grumble, but you also feel relieved because in the Viking longhouse, fresh straw was not a luxury. I hope you can sleep a little better tonight. You pull the cloak up and over your shoulders, but it doesn't help. You keep twitching and scratching. This time, it's not the straw. It's the uninvited guests living in your bedding. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common in the warm Viking longhouses, just as they are in most modern homes. If the cold didn't keep you up at night, the itching certainly did. Survival in a smoky timber hall was never about perfect comfort. It was about dealing with the constant irritation of tiny creatures that live closer to your skin than you'd like. Experts who study the past have found proof of this. When Viking graves are dug up, bits of cloth are often found. These can show whether there were fleas or lice in the grave. One study from York, which used to be a Viking city, found combs full of head lice and bedding with lots of flea droppings. These are not just one-off events. Pests were everywhere. Everyone scratched. Warriors, farmers, and even chieftains all sleep with fleas crawling over their furs. The Longhouse was warm enough for people to live in and warm enough for insects to survive. Now close your eyes and imagine it. You're about to fall asleep, but then you feel an itch on your ankle and you wake up. You scratch, roll over, and another bite pricks your shoulder. The straw rustles as you move again. Others do the same. Their small movements make the benches shake. The hall breathes, snores, coughs, and scratches. Fleas were a big part of Viking nights. Here's something interesting that might make you smile, but not in a good way. Vikings often had combs that could be used on both sides. These combs were some of the most common personal items found in Viking burials. One side had wider teeth for grooming hair, and the other side had finer teeth for catching lice. Imagine a family sat round a fire at night, not just telling stories, but also flicking lice heads into the flames. Washing and grooming were a chance for them to spend time together. Maybe even laughter made the situation less frustrating, with one person teasing another for having fleas in their hair. But pests weren't only in the hair. They lived in the very furs and blankets that were meant to protect you. Animal hides kept us warm, but they also made it easy for fleas to get in. In winter, when the bedding wasn't washed or replaced, infestations got much worse. Some experts studying old Scandinavian farmhouses noticed that children joked about night fleas keeping them awake. This suggests that itching was seen as just a part of life. Sleep meant putting up with the tiny stings as much as the cold air coming through the turf. Experts disagree about how much of a health risk these pests really pose. Some people think that the constant irritation led to skin infections or made people more likely to get sick. Others think that while annoying, the human body simply adapted and communities learned to live with it. The evidence is inconclusive, but the debate shows just how important these tiny creatures were to daily life. Imagine how that would affect your senses. You can smell smoke and wool on your cloak, the warm feel of furs, the quiet sound of someone across the hall dragging nails across their skin. Even animals were affected. Cows and goats brought their own insects indoors, which made a lot of noise. You might laugh, thinking it's funny that the only creatures that were doing well in the Longhouse were the fleas. One strange piece of archaeological information comes from ash that was sprinkled into layers of rock. Experts think that ashes were used on purpose to dry out damp straw and to keep away pests. Was it effective? Maybe a little. You imagine a mother throwing gray dust over the bedding before adding fresh straw, hoping the grit would stop fleas making nests. It's a basic insecticide that was created because it was needed, but there were other folk remedies too. Some later traditions suggest putting strong-smelling herbs like tansy or juniper in bedding for the smell and to keep insects away. Did the Vikings do the same? There is no proof, but because they know the local plants well, it's possible. Imagine falling asleep on straw that has been soaked in crushed juniper berries. The strong smell, mixed with smoke and the smell of fur that had been wet. Did it help, or would just make the itch smell better? Historians are still not sure. The emotional impact can't be ignored either. Nights were never really restful when pests were active. Parents may have spent long hours calming children who were crying from itchy bites. Couples whispered curses at fleas bouncing under blankets. Even the toughest warriors who could face icy seas and battlefields must have felt embarrassed at the thought of scratching like dogs through the night. But fleas and lice became a way of life. Combs were as necessary as swords, and dousing fireside was as common as storytelling. Being a Viking meant being prepared to deal with challenges like cold weather, smoke, and pests. You can't get rid of all the pain, but you can handle it. You're sitting under your warm animal skins, scratching your arm and breathing out deeply. Then you understand something more. The Viking night was full of mistakes. Warmth came wrapped in smoke. Companionship meant noise, and bedding came crawling with fleas. But people still slept, still dreamed, still woke up, ready to sail, farm, and fight. Sleep was never about comfort. It was about staying strong. The Vikings survived the winter and the fleas that bit them. The smoke is thicker tonight, and as you lie under the hides, you feel something more than just the physical warmth. For the Vikings, sleep was more than just something your body needs. It was important in the world of magic and superstition. The hearth, the furs, and even the straw under your feet all had deeper meanings. Warmth itself was very important and was connected to gods, ancestors, and unseen guardians. We can find out about Viking life from things they left behind and stories about them. Small shrines in people's homes, carved figures, and signs of offerings near hearths suggest that the fire was more than just something to cook on. It was the home of divine protectors. Tending the fire fed the spirit of the home. Each glowing ember was a symbol of life, not just heat. You can imagine someone quietly saying a prayer while putting a log on the fire. They might be asking Thor to protect the house from frost, or calling on Freya to watch over the sleeping children. One well-known fact is that the hearth is often linked to the land spirits of the area. People thought these beings would stay near houses and protect them or punish people who didn't take care of them. A family that fed the fire well and kept the hall tidy was able to protect themselves. If a family stops caring about their home and family, bad things might happen to them. This meant that survival rituals were also seen as rituals of devotion. And then there's a charming little detail found in later Scandinavian folk traditions. People sometimes placed iron objects like knives or keys near children's bedding to protect them from evil. Was this done in the Viking Age? The details are unclear, but it's easy to imagine a mother placing her child between herself and her husband, placing a small iron amulet under the straw, and believing the metal would keep away ghosts or diseases. Scholars do not all agree on how formal these domestic beliefs were. Some people say that these beliefs were just normal superstitions that were passed on from family to family, and they were never written down. Others think they were formal, ritualized events that took place during seasonal festivals like Yule. During these festivals, bedding was changed and fires were blessed. The truth may be somewhere in the middle, a mixture of practical actions and secret prayers, which are not recorded but which are deeply felt. The sensory experience of this belief is very strong. Picture yourself lying on straw with a fire close by and hearing a grandmother say magic words to protect you from frost giants. The smoke becomes more than just an irritation. It is a shield. The furs feel heavier, not just because they are warm, but also because they have a special meaning. It feels as though the furs are made by ancestors who are close to you. The night is a mix of physical and mental strength. One interesting archaeological find comes from graves where bedding goods were included. Children were buried with tiny fur blankets, adults with cloaks, and sometimes even the whole bedding set. Why would anyone take bedding into the afterlife if they didn't think warmth was important after death? It was impossible to imagine sleeping forever without a bed. This shows that for the Vikings, being warm was very important for their physical and spiritual well-being. Think about the part that dreams play. In a smoky room, half awake in the middle of sleep, dreams would have felt real and strange. Sagas often describe dreams of ancestors or gods visiting in the night. Could the smoke and the flames have made these visions seem more real? If a Viking had such a dream, they might tell everyone in the village the next morning that a spirit had spoken to them. This spirit might have given them advice about the harvest or warned them of danger. So even when he couldn't sleep, he was still connected to the divine. Here's something interesting. Some scholars think that the difficult conditions, like smoke, pests, and not much space, might have made the spiritual side of the night more important. I felt uncomfortable and confused. It was hard to tell if I was awake or dreaming. I felt like there were strange things in the air. Did the Vikings see frost not just as weather, but as a spirit pressing against the walls? Did every gust of cold air feel like an opponent to the warm hearth? It's a debate that's relevant to both anthropology and history. Now try to think like that. You lie in your cloak with your child pressed against you and hear the fire hiss. You whisper a few words, not because you fully understand them, but because everyone else does. The words are a shield, like a cloak, like straw, like walls. Your warmth is physical, yes, but also spiritual. You believe it keeps you safe. This belief can be comforting. The Viking night was about more than just a battle of cold against fire. It was a battle between human strength and the hidden forces of the world. The Longhouse became a sanctuary, not just of wood and turf, but of spirit and song. Warmth was a gift, and in that culture, gifts were always meant to be given back. You fed the fire, and it fed you back. You honored the spirits, and in return, they protected you from the cold. So, as you close your eyes and imagine being in a room full of smoke, you feel more than just a bit uncomfortable. You can feel the presence of the gods and ancestors like shadows above you, making the Longhouse feel warm. Then you realize that sleeping in a Viking winter was about more than just trusting the fire and furs. It was also about trusting that unseen hands would protect you through the night. The Longhouse is quiet again, but not completely silent. The flames are low, the shadows are long, and you see a quiet ritual happening by the fire. Someone is stirring the coals with their hands, which are covered in gray dust. They aren't starting a new fire. Not yet. They're taking care of what is already there, making it last until morning. Charcoal, ash, and embers. These are the tools used by the Vikings to spread fire through the dark nights. If it wasn't for them, every morning would be a cold start. Archaeological remains of hearths often contain thick layers of ash, not just from burning, but from deliberate banking. Families spread out over the glowing embers before sleeping, keeping the heat in. In the morning, the sleeper closest to the hearth could push the ash aside, revealing a faint red glow, and then add new wood. This method saved fuel and meant that there was no need to use flint and tinder every morning. You imagine yourself leaning over the fire, the ash on your face, as you carefully uncover a tiny piece of ash like a hidden treasure. One thing we do know for sure comes from later medieval sources. People often rake the fire into ash piles. The two situations are very similar, so it's almost certain that the Vikings did the same thing. The technology was simple but effective. In the north, they were very careful to save fire. Ash became a blanket for embers, and embers became a promise of survival. Here's an interesting fact. Ash was more than just insulation. It also worked as a cleaning agent. In the past, people sometimes rubbed ash on their hair or used it to clean greasy pots. Imagine getting in a bed with ash still on your fingernails, knowing it was the same substance keeping your home warm. In the Viking world, they didn't waste anything, not even soot. Now think about what it's like to use your senses. At night, the fire was less of a blazing fire and more like a faintly glowing snake of coals, shifting red under its gray skin. You could hear occasional pops as tiny sparks escape from where they were buried. Look closely and you'll see little threads of light weaving through the ash. You could still smell the smoke, mixed with the smell of damp wool and fur. That slight warmth was enough to stop the frost from biting too hard. To a Viking, those glowing coals were as valuable as silver. Experts still can't agree on how many fires were actually started at the same time. Some people think that Longhouses had one big hearth in the middle, taken care of by the people who lived there. Others think that there were lots of smaller fires in the hall. Excavations in Greenland revealed several burned patches. These may have been separate hearths. Was this just to cover all bases in case one fire failed? Or was it just because they needed to heat such big spaces? The evidence leads to ongoing discussion, and you can imagine either a big fire that has gone out or lots of little hearts that are glowing dimly across the Longhouse. Also, think about the human responsibility involved in this ritual. Someone had to wake up at night to check the embers, push them together, and add a bit of fuel. It was a task that everyone in the family did, but nobody ever said they had to. Picture a man who is still feeling sleepy, breathing heavily, and making his way to the fireplace to stir up the ashes. He makes a noise, like a snore, and then he falls back onto the bench. Job done. These half-asleep guardians kept the warmth alive. Saras has also sent us some more information. Sometimes fires are said to die in the night. This can leave people having to put out their own fires after their neighbors' fires have been reignited. In such cases, someone might walk through the snow carrying a clay pot, trying to get it home before the fire went out. Taking fire was a practical thing to do, and it was also a symbol. It reminded people that warmth was something that everyone shared. If you lost your hearth, you had to rely on the kindness of others, which was another way in which Viking villages were connected. Now, imagine yourself at dawn. The hall is still dim. The fire is low. You are nervous and move towards a fireplace. Ash crumbles under your fingers, and with a small thrill, you uncover the faint orange eye of a flame. You should feed it twigs and then a branch. The glow gets brighter, smoke goes up, and life comes back to the hall. You're glad that they are not shocked when you start again. At that moment, you feel like you've kept a secret for a long time, like it's a bridge from the evening to the morning. Experts are still asking, how much wood did these Longhouses use? Some people think they're several tons each winter, which is a lot. It means you have to keep chopping and hauling them all the time. Banking members under ash was not just convenient, it was necessary. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to meet fuel demands. Each ember that was kept alive meant that fewer trees had to be cut down, and people had less time to use tools like axes and saws. It's important not to forget the emotional side of this practice. It was a sign that they were safe when they woke up in the dark and saw the faint glow. The flame was proof that the house was alive. The family was still all together and feeling warm and cozy. If it had not been there, it would have been very scary and would have looked weak. Every morning, you can almost hear people breathing a sigh of relief as they finally see that hard-to-reach glow. You relax back on your bed, imagining the ashy hearth. It may not roar. It may not be the most exciting, but its quiet endurance is more important than being flashy. For the Vikings, survival was more about keeping a tiny flame alive through the night than about making a big fire. That flame was like the heartbeat of the hall, glowing gently under its gray cover, a promise that even in the coldest, darkest day, the sun would still come up. The flame glows dimly in the ashes, but not all Viking families relied only on the hearth. Some people try to use tools and tricks to push the coal back further. They used iron braziers and oil lamps in their smoky halls. These were not common luxuries. Iron was very valuable, and oil was even more so. However, in some homes, they provided a small, portable source of warmth and light when the main fire was not working. When archaeologists dig up important Viking sites, they sometimes find bits of metal boxes and small iron containers that have been blackened by heat. These were filled with glowing coals and moved around the room, creating pockets of warmth wherever needed. Imagine a tired woman putting a lamp near her children's bed. The soft red light is just bright enough to block the cold wind that is coming through the wall. Unlike the central hearth, which was fixed, these braziers were flexible, so they could be moved to wherever it was needed to keep everyone warm. Oil lamps are also found in old records of archaeology. Small bowls made of stone or clay. The edges of the bowls are scorched by the flames. Animal fat or fish oil filled the containers with a simple wick that drew the liquid fire. These lamps provided light, but they also provided a little heat. This heat was small and flickering, but it was very important when the temperature was low. Picture the faint smell of fish oil mixed with the smoke from the fire, and a child's eyes showing the flames dancing as stories went on all through the night. It is well known that Norse settlers in Greenland and Iceland depended a lot on fish oil lamps during the long winter months when there was not much wood. This may have started happening in richer homes in Scandinavia too, where lamps were used to light the hearth. The light from the oil wasn't bright enough to light up the whole hall, but it made the dark feel less heavy and more like a home. And then there's a strange little discovery from experiments with recreated Longhouses. Iron braziers often made the air worse. Moving hot coals around made more smoke and was a fire hazard. Some people who reenact history describe coughing when they tested braziers in small spaces, joking that Vikings must have either been tougher or more desperate than modern lungs could endure. It's as if someone is dragging a brazier too close to a straw mattress. Sparks flew and people shouted in the dark. Survival and danger were always close together. Experts still can't agree on how common these tools were. Some people say that they were only for rich people like chieftains, rich traders, or people who could afford iron and oil. Others think they were more common because stone lamps are simple to make, and sometimes people have found bits of braziers even in simple farmhouses. People still disagree about this, but the bits of archaeology show that at least some families slept with extra warmth. Now, think about how it looks and feels. A brazier hisses as a coal shifts inside, sending up a thin thread of smoke. The faint red glow illuminates faces around it, warm in a circle barely large enough for 2 or 3 sleepers. An oil lamp flickers, its flame going out when a breeze comes in, then getting stronger again. The smell of fish oil is strong and heavy, and it sticks to wool and fur. But in that circle of dim light, fear of the dark goes away, and warmth enters stiff fingers. Some people later believed that lamps had protective powers. People believe that a flame kept burning all night was a way of keeping away bad spirits and ghosts. Did the Vikings already believe this? There is not much evidence, but the fact that it has been done for a long time suggests that it may have been. Imagine a family who don't want to let the lamp die. They don't just need the light, they also need the flame to keep the frost spirits away. In a world where the walls were often cold and the nights were long, that faith was as important as the heat itself. From a practical point of view, braziers and lamps show that the Vikings were willing to experiment with technology. They didn't just use one strategy. They used different solutions to get the job done. They put a fire at the center, coals in a brazier, oil in a lamp, furs over bodies all together, creating a web of defenses against the endless winter. Each solution had its risks, but together they made things a bit better. Also think about the effect this will have on people. For a child lying awake in the dark, a small oil lamp might have made them feel more comfortable than the big hearth. The big fire smoked and roared. The lamp glowed softly, like a personal guardian. To fall asleep in its light was to feel safe, even when there was a lot of noise outside. As you drift into this picture, you see the Viking Longhouse not as a single, smoky room, but as a patchwork of glowing hearths. The hearth is at the center, the brazier glows by the bench, and the lamp flickers near the door. Each flame lit up the darkness in its own way. Each spark reminds us that survival came not from one big solution, but from lots of small fires that were taken care of throughout the night. And when morning finally came, the embers, the lamps, and the brazier showed that they had all survived another winter's night. It was never comfortable, and it never had any luxury features, but it was always enough. In the Viking Age, everything was important. The Longhouse shakes in the wind, and you run your hand along the wall. The wood feels rough, heavy, and solid. But it isn't just wood. It's clever carpentry. It's like insulation, which was also used by another Viking talent, shipbuilding. These people weren't just farmers and raiders. They were highly skilled sailors, and some of the ways they kept water out of their ships also helped them keep the cold out of their homes. People who study old buildings often say that the longhouse structures look like ships. The walls sloped inwards, like the hull of a boat, which made them more stable in storms and snow. The roofs, made of overlapping layers of turf, looked like planks on a ship, with each piece soaking up water from the one below. It's as if every Viking carried the sea home with them in the very shape of their dwelling. One detail that is well supported comes from Greenland, where settlers built homes with double walls, an inner timber frame, and an outer layer of turf packed tightly with earth, and sometimes even seaweed. The seaweed kept the water from getting in and kept the heat in. Imagine the crackle of dried kelp stuffed between logs. This is an unlikely but effective barrier against the icy air. They also build ships. The wood is filled with stuffing, and there's also okame, moss, and animal hair between the planks to keep water out. The same principle applied to houses kept the wind from slicing through. Here's a fun fact. Some longhouses may have been built using wood from old ships. Wood was very valuable in Scandinavia, and when a ship was no longer able to sail, its strong oak ribs could be used to build a house. You might be sleeping on a bed that was made with wood from trees that grew on the other side of the North Sea. Those trees might have creaked with waves before they creaked with winter storms. Even today, experts are still discussing whether the methods used to build ships had a direct effect on architecture. Some people say that the similarities are just a coincidence and that the practical solutions came about separately. Others say the similarities are too obvious to ignore and that shipwrights deliberately used their skills to build houses. We don't have much evidence, so the question is still unanswered, but the idea is tempting. The sea and the hearth are both built on the same logic. Close your eyes and imagine what it would feel like to touch these walls, which are shaped like a ship. The inward slope makes the hull feel like a sheltering hull, embracing you in its frame. Snow slides off the turf roof, just like water slides off a deck. You can hear the wood under the wind, like planks under a wave. The Longhouse becomes not just a house, but a beach ship carrying its crew through winter instead of across oceans. Another interesting connection is with corking. Viking ships were sealed with tar and resin to keep them watertight. Some evidence suggests that similar sealants were smeared into the gaps in the house timbers to block drafts. Picture the strong, sharp smell of tar mixing with smoke and wool inside the hull. For modern noses, it would be too strong. For the Vikings, it was probably the smell of safety. The same scent that kept ships afloat also kept children from freezing. And then there's the matter of air circulation. Ships needed air to keep the areas below deck alive, and houses needed airflow to let smoke escape. Some old houses have vents angled like hatches that can be opened or closed depending on the wind. Did this way of thinking about the sea come to the land? Experts are still discussing it, but the similarities are clear. A Viking shipwright might have seen a smoke hole in the roof and thought of it as just another hatch, another way to balance air and enclosure. Also think about the symbolic layer. For a nation that lives on the sea, a ship was more than just a way to get from one place to another. It was about who they were, how well respected they were, and the stories about them. It may not have been practical to build homes that looked like ships. It may have been a cultural thing, a way of connecting daily life to the sea. Picture a Viking farmer looking at his turf-roofed hall and saying, half in jest, "This house sails through winter." Now think about what it would be like to be inside one of these. The turf roof stops the wind from blowing too strongly. The double walls keep the wind out, and the whole place feels sturdier than a simple wooden shack. You may still feel unwell from smoke, itchy from fleas, and make noise by bumping into neighbors, but you also feel safe. The house is more than just wood and earth. It's the work of people who knew how to change nature to suit humans. Experts still can't agree on whether the ship logic was planned or just a coincidence. Some people say that builders just used whatever knowledge they had. Others suggested that the way of life of sailors was reflected in everything, including people's homes. Either way, the result was clear. Long houses that could withstand storms like ships could withstand waves. So, as you press your palm against the wooden wall, you can feel its texture, smell its tar, and hear it creak. You realize you're inside a vessel, not for water, but for winter. This ship was built not to sail the seas, but to survive the nights. And when you realize this, you see how well Viking adaptation works. The same hands that carved dragon-headed prows also built halls where families huddled through endless cold. The fire crackles gently, and above it, words can be heard floating in the smoky air. Even when they are tired, people's voices tell stories, and these stories leave clues. When archaeologists and historians look for evidence of how Vikings slept, they don't only look at ruins or artifacts. They also use sagas, Eddic poems, and medieval texts. These texts, which are a mixture of history and myth, talk about nights spent in the Longhouse. Sometimes they do this in a casual way, as if sleep was just another part of life. One thing is clear. Saga authors often mention the elf or hear half-describing characters lying by the fire or turning in on benches. These simple phrases show that benches line the walls and people lay beside the central fire. They also show how normal the arrangement was. There's nothing special about it, just a simple note. Of course, people slept in smoky halls. It was so normal that it didn't need explaining. But every so often, stories give us a better idea. In the Erbigja saga, there's a mention of people gathering round a fire late at night. They sat there talking and listening to stories before finally going to bed. You can picture it, a hall full of people laughing, talking, and gossiping, and then, slowly, people sitting down under cloaks. The noise faded into snoring. It's the rhythm of night that's been captured in the story. Here's an interesting piece of information. In some poems, heroes are described as sleeping with weapons next to them. Archaeologists also support this idea. They have found swords and spears in burials where the dead were laid out as if ready to rise again. In everyday life, this might mean that warriors always kept their weapons close, even when they were asleep, just in case they were attacked by raiders or enemies at night. Picture yourself lying on straw, with furs pulled up high, one hand resting on your sword handle. You feel both comfortable and watchful. However, scholars disagree about how literally to take these descriptions. Were they based on real habits, or were they made up? Some people say that sagas were written hundreds of years after the Viking Age, and that they may be a bit exaggerated. Others say that the way in which casual details are consistent points to the truth. It is one of those historical puzzles where the way you understand it is as important as the evidence. Now think about the poetry itself. Skaldic verses sometimes describe halls filled with smoke from fire or people squashed together. These images are not direct, but they add detail to what is real. Smoke is thick enough to be a metaphor, and there are enough people on the benches to be a part of a poem. Even when poets try to write about big, important things, the small details of sleep slipped in. One strange detail in some stories is how restless nights are described. They talk about ghosts whispering, dreams feeling heavy, and ghostly visitors touching sleepers' chests. Were these just a way of telling a story, or were they actually based on what smoky, uneasy nights felt like? Anyone who has woken up feeling congested and coughing knows how easily dreams can turn into nightmares. Maybe the saga showed that confusion more honestly than they meant to. You can feel it yourself as you lie here, half waking in the Longhouse. The rafters of the roof are very high, and shadows from the fire move like ghosts. A child wakes up, makes a noise, and then goes back to sleep. Someone whispers a prayer. Another coughs, and the hall goes quiet again. In that half-light, it's easy to believe in dreams with teeth, in ancestors stepping down from smoke to speak. Historians also use these texts to understand social practices. At feasts, people sat according to their social rank. The most important people sat closest to the fire, while the less important people sat further away from the door. A saga is a story about someone's place on the bench. It's a symbol of status that's reflected in every night's sleep. Even the social hierarchy had an effect on who was able to stay warm and who was not. Another interesting word is sliver, which means bed. This word appears in Old Norse texts, but is often used to talk about bedding, straw, furs, and cloaks spread on the floor. The language itself tells us that bed was less a structure and more a bundle. You weren't given a room. You were given a stack of materials, either on a bench or on the ground. The words used are similar to the real situation. Sleep was easy to move around, easy to fit into other activities, and never as private as we think. Scholars still can't agree on how important these hints should be. Some people see them as a way of remembering the past, like photos of what daily life was like. Others say that they were literary devices shaped by later Christian scribes, and that they are not always reliable. But when you combine this with archaeology, the pieces fit together enough to create a picture. You're left with a hall that smells of smoke, benches lined with straw, bodies wrapped in cloaks, and stories fading into snores. The sensory texture of this literary evidence matters. Imagine the sound of saragas being recited while you're lying in the Longhouse. The words rise above the crackle of fire, creating images of gods and battles as you scratch at fleas under your cloak. The heroic and the mundane mix perfectly. In Viking times, sleeping was always connected to storytelling. It happened right in the middle of them. As you roll onto your side, feeling the stinging pain in your eyes, you realize that sagas are more than just a form of entertainment. They let us see what people's lives and sleep were like. They don't describe luxury. They describe survival as a part of the story. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if tomorrow's storytellers will remember you. It's just another person in the Longhouse at night, scaring everyone by scratching in the dark and muttering by the fire. The hall tonight feels almost festive. The benches are full of people. There are family, neighbors, and travelers. A feast has continued into the night, and the warmth it brings is more than just a feeling. In Viking society, winter feasts were important for survival as well as for celebrating gods and family. The fire burned brighter, the food was tastier, the drinks were flowing, and everyone was flushed and ready to collapse into sleep. The house was packed with people having fun, but it was warmer than on quieter nights. There are signs of these gatherings in the form of very big halls, some of which are much bigger than what a single family would have needed. These so-called feasting halls had wider hearths, more benches, and sometimes signs that food was cooked in large amounts. The sagas also tell of banquets that went on all night, where songs were sung, boasts shouted, and meat eaten in huge amounts. After such a big party, the benches and floors must have been full of people asleep, men and women dropping wherever they could, cloaks pulled over their heads, bellies warm with stew and ale. One important detail is the midden turf feast called Yule. It wasn't just about ritual sacrifice or honoring gods. It was a time of plenty of food and fire at the darkest time of year. Eating a lot in the coldest weeks made sure they had strength for the lean months ahead. When lots of people got together in the hall, the heat from all their bodies made the room feel much warmer. You can almost feel it now, the air thicker the frost outside beaten back by laughter and sweat. There's an interesting story in the saga that tells of guests who got very drunk. These guests would fall onto their cloaks and sleep near the logs, which looked like people. These logs were next to the fire. These weren't just places for people to sleep. They were a sign of a community in decline. You can imagine waking up in the night to find someone else's elbow on your chest, or tripping over someone who had fallen asleep in the middle of the song. After a feast, the Longhouse must have looked like a battlefield of snoring bodies spread out in a mess. Experts are still discussing how often these big meetings happened. Some people think they were held once a year or just at certain times of the year, like during the Yule or harvest festivals. Others suggest that in wealthier communities, feasting was common, a way for chieftains to show generosity and maintain loyalty. Either way, it was the same result. On feast nights, the hall became both warmer and noisier, providing a temporary shelter from both the cold and loneliness. Now, use your senses to imagine what it would be like to be there. The fire is very hot and is sending smoke and sparks up into the rafters. The smell of roasted pork and spiced meat still fills the air, clinging to old cloaks and beards. The floor is sticky with spilled beer. The bench is full of people who are feeling tired and have had too much to drink. The music has become quiet, then turns into the deep, humming sound of someone snoring. The heat is almost too much. Your cheeks went red, even as cold air came in through the cracks in the wall. You drift off not to silence, but to the quiet hum of community. There's a deeper sense of psychological comfort in this, too. A hall full of guests meant more than just heat. It made them feel safe. People who didn't know us were our allies for the night. They made it less likely that we would be attacked. The noise of all the bodies was more than just a physical barrier. It was a way of keeping people apart to stop them from feeling afraid. Strange as it may seem, some writers in the late medieval period made fun of these feasts, calling the Norse people greedy, drunk, or disorderly. But there is a truth behind the criticism. Feasts worked. They made people feel closer to each other, gave them food, kept them warm, and helped them through the hardest times. Outsiders saw this as chaos, but for the Vikings, it was a way of surviving. But scientists are still trying to work out what these nights do for our body clock. Did families sleep worse on feast nights because of noise and crowds? Or did the extra warmth make up for the inconvenience? Reenactments and reconstructed halls suggest the latter. A lot of people in a small space made it so hot that even thin bedding felt really nice. It was worth feeling uncomfortable if it meant not freezing. Imagine you're lying on a straw mattress with a cloak over your head, while lots of other people snore and mutter around you. Somewhere nearby, a man talks in his sleep, boasting of his victories. A child cries in a dream. The fire crackles. An uncle who has had too much to drink groans, and the hall shakes as everyone moves during the night. It is messy, loud, and yet oddly comforting. You feel good because of the warmth of the food, the sound of the music, and the closeness of other people. As the sun comes up, the hall will fill with the sounds of people moving around and having fun. People told stories about who snore the loudest, who spilled beer, and who tried to sit on the wrong bench. You will remember the warm feeling longer than you will the headache. In the Viking world, nights like these were not a problem for survival. They were a way of surviving, but they were also a way of celebrating. You sink deeper into your furs, full of food, and you understand the quiet brilliance of Viking feasting. It wasn't just a guilty pleasure. It was protection against the cold, sadness, and loneliness of winter. In the noisy, smoky hall, you fall asleep to the sound of all the people around you. The embers glow low, and you wait to find a stranger curled not far from your feet. His cloak is dirty from traveling. His boots were still covered in frozen mud. He isn't family or a neighbor, but he has been given a corner of the bench for the night. In the Viking world, being hospitable was not a luxury. It was simply a matter of survival. If a traveler came to your door in winter, you wouldn't leave him to freeze. You brought him into the smoky Longhouse, shared a fire and food with him, and gave him space to sleep, however cramped. The sagas are full of references to this. Visitors asked for fire and seat as a matter of right, and hosts were judged by how generously they gave it. Archaeologists prove this was true because some longhouses were very big. Many were built large enough for families, livestock, and guests. The unspoken rule was clear. In the north, a closed door could mean death. A house that opened itself was considered a sign of honor. A house that refused to be ashamed of its owner. You can almost feel it as you roll over in your bed. The stranger exhales, his breath mixing with yours in the smoky air. He makes the hall feel warmer, but less comfortable. His snoring joins in. His body heat makes the water feel warmer. You might complain about his smell, but you know you would want the same kindness if you arrived here, half frozen on a stormy night. One interesting detail from stories about Icelanders is the idea of the jester's room, which is sometimes mentioned in texts. Whether this was a real room or just a special part of the hall, it shows how important hospitality was. Even in very small houses, there was always a bit of space for newcomers. Here's an interesting fact. Some stories say that guests were expected to share gossip or news in return for a place to stay. Hospitality wasn't just about being friendly and giving people food. It was just a simple exchange of information. Picture this. You're half asleep, hearing a traveler's secret stories about far-off markets, kings, and storms. At the same time, children are nestled close by, eager to catch any tales of lands they'll never visit. A guest to make you feel good in body and mind. Scientists are still discussing whether this generosity was completely selfless. Some people say that the Vikings were friendly with other tribes, not just because they had a lot of money, but also because they had a good reputation. If you were a Viking and you were known for being friendly, other Vikings would help you if you needed it. Others suggest it was simply a practical decision to turn away. Strangers might make enemies or cast curses. In any case, the Longhouse was full of people, including family, relatives, servants, and travelers, all living and breathing together under the same smoky roof. Now, imagine how overwhelming it would be to see, hear, and feel everything that happens at one time. You already sleep next to children and animals. Add to that a few travelers who are still wet from the snow, their cloaks heavy with frost which is melting into puddles on the floor. The smell gets stronger and stronger, and you can smell sweat, wet wool, manure, and fish oil from lamps. The benches are full, straw flattened by unfamiliar bodies. Your elbows and knees are pressing into your ribs. Privacy, which is already rare, disappears completely. But the warmth rises, the hall feels fuller, and the night becomes bearable. We have even found evidence from burial sites that some travelers were honored enough to be buried with their bedding. Maybe their status as guests was important, and being hosted in life was linked to being hosted in death with furs and cloaks. If true, it shows how important it was to the Vikings to share warmth. Also think about the emotional balance. Welcoming strangers meant safety and potential friendship, but it also meant risk. Was this man by your feet really harmless? Did he carry illness, secrets, or bad intentions? As you sat sharing your fire in the smoky dark, you might have wondered. Trust was necessary and was tested every night by the guests who slept on the straw. Here's something that might make you laugh. Later medieval sources complain about rowdy guests who drank too much and stayed too long, as if Viking hosts sometimes regretted their generosity. Picture the frustration of having to drag a drunk traveler out of the hall at dawn, only to have him wish you had left him outside in the snow. But the law of hospitality was more important than being annoyed. The hall was very important for King and for anyone who came to visit. You close your eyes again, feeling the stranger's breath in the shared warmth of the Longhouse. He is there, and that makes some people feel uncomfortable, but he is needed. In the Viking world, no one survived winter on their own. Hospitality was the thing that brought families, villages, and strangers together. It was noisy, smoky, and crowded, but that was normal. As you drift into bad dreams, you realize that the hall itself was less a house than a living network of survival, binding together everyone who needed its heat. The hall falls silent again, but you can't stop thinking about the graves you left behind. When archaeologists dig up old graves, they often find more than just dead bodies. They also find weapons, jewelry, and tools that the dead people had with them when they died. Sometimes they even find bedding, straw, bits of fur, tufts of wool, and whole blankets that have been folded up next to the bodies. For the Vikings, the way you sleep in life is a sign of how you will die. A grave without warmth was not an option. One of the clearest examples of this is the Oborg ship burial in Norway. This burial shows two women of high status who were laid on beds covered in textiles and animal skins. The bits of fabric, though worn out, showed detailed weaves and colors, suggesting that these were luxury sheets for someone's final trip. Archaeologists often find traces of wool and fur in ordinary graves. It's as if every Viking, no matter how poor, was guaranteed a bed for life. The logic is simple but important. If being warm was important for survival, it was important too in the afterlife. A dead child was wrapped in a fur blanket. A warrior was laid with his cloak. A woman was given her bedding as if she might need to rest after the long journey to the other world. In these burials, you can see that sleep and death were seen as the same thing. They both need comfort and warmth. Here's something interesting. In some graves, archaeologists have found feathers mixed with wool. This suggests that people had down pillows or mattresses. These seem to be mostly owned by elites, which suggests that even after death, status still mattered. You can see the difference. One man was buried with rough straw, the other with downy feathers. Even though they were silent, both men were still trying to keep warm. Experts are still discussing what these burial goods meant. Were they meant to comfort the dead on their journey? Or were they simply decorations showing that the person had owned nice bedding? Some scholars say that it is useful for the soul, while others say that it is useful for society to see. As is often the case, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But the message is clear, whether it is meant to be a symbol or is actually useful. Bedding was important. Furs, wool, and straw were very important to people's identity, just like weapons or jewelry. The Vikings did not see a difference between survival and meaning. The blankets that kept the family warm also carried them into the next world. Now, imagine you are standing at a burial mound. It is cold and families gather to bury someone. They cover him in his cloak, tuck a fur around him, and maybe even spread straw beneath his body. The gestures are quiet, tender, and familiar. The same actions they did every night in the Longhouse were now happening one last time. To bury someone was to put them to bed, and to believe that even after they had died, it would still be important to keep them warm. Also, think about the sensory impressions left behind. The smell of wool, the feel of fur, the crunch of straw under a dead body. All these things remind the living of nights spent in smoky halls. Funerals weren't strange events. They were a normal part of their daily lives. The bedding that cradled the dead was the same bedding that had cradled the living every night. One strange discovery from Burka in Sweden showed a child's grave covered with birch bark under the straw. Scholars are unsure whether this was extra insulation or a symbol of purity. This shows that even the smallest details of comfort were included in burial practices. The dead were not buried naked. They were wrapped as if for sleep. The sagas also keep records of this overlap. Warriors are described as lying down with cloaks pulled tight, both in life and in death. The same language connects the two states, which strengthens the cultural belief that sleep and death are connected. Death was just a longer night, and you still needed to get into bed. Here's another interesting thing to think about. Many graves have animals near them, such as horses, dogs, and even cattle. Some people think of these as symbolic companions, but think about the real situation. The animals slept very close to each other in the Longhouse every night. Dying next to animals may have reminded people of the close-knit community where everyone lived together in harmony with nature. Experts are still debating how important this is. Some people think that bedding in graves was mostly about status, a way to show off valuable textiles and furs. Others focus on spiritual symbolism, believing that rest and warmth are needed after death. Both views are valid. Viking burials show that they paid a lot of attention to the physical aspects of sleep. Now let yourself feel it. Imagine lying in your cloak, knowing that one day it will be used to bury you. Imagine you are smoothing a fur over a child, knowing that one day that fur might be in a grave. In a world where it was always very cold, people thought of death as another night to survive. Being warm was very important. So, as you curl up again on your imaginary bench, scratching at straw and pulling your cloak closer, you realize that the Vikings didn't separate life, sleep, and death. All three were connected, and all three were shaped by the same furs, cloaks, and fires. To live was to fight the cold. Sleeping was a shared experience. When you died, you took that fight with you into the next world, wrapped in the same bedding that had kept you warm through many nights. The hall feels different tonight, more restless and unsettled. Sleep doesn't come easily, and you can sense why. In Viking culture, the night was not just a time to rest. It was a dangerous time. It was dark and full of uncertainty. There were whispers of raiders, spirits, and dreams that might not be dreams at all. To lie down under your cloak wasn't just to close your eyes against the cold. It was to place your trust in the weak defenses of wood, fire, and community. Sagas show us this unease. Characters sometimes talk about being kept awake by fear or getting up in the night to check doors and fires. The Longhouse was never completely safe. The walls of timber and turf could protect it from frost. But what about thieves getting in through the back door at night? What about enemies who wait for families to fall asleep before attacking? One story is about raiders who burst into a hall at dawn and start cutting down men who are still asleep. Nights were not always safe. They could be traps. One thing archaeologists often notice is that there are weapons near where people sleep. Graves show swords laid at the sides of men and women, and sometimes children are shown with knives. This suggests that the weapons weren't locked away. They stayed close together, ready to be seized at any moment. Picture yourself lying down with a spear held against the bench, its shadow stretched out across the smoky wall. He slept lightly, but always with one ear open, listening for the sound of snow crunching underfoot. Here's something interesting. Sagas sometimes talked about dogs sleeping in halls to protect the building. If strangers approached, their barks would be heard. Dogs were more than just pets. They were alarm systems. If a man hears a restless growl in the dark, he might reach for his axe before he even opens his eyes. Even though you felt safe and loved, you were also worried. Scholars still don't know how deep this fear went. Some people say that Viking villages were close-knit communities where neighbors were so close that raids were rare and nights were mostly peaceful. Others say that sagas show that people were really worried that violence could happen at any time. This disagreement shows that the evidence is unclear. But whether fear was constant or occasional, it made people think about sleep in a different way. They thought of sleep not as giving in to fear, but as being watchful. Now, think about how this fear affects your senses. You're wrapped in furs, but every time you hear a creaking noise, your heart jumps. The wind changes direction, making the roof boards rattle, and you wonder if it's a storm or footsteps. Smoke swirls into weird shapes above the fire, and you start to imagine ghosts. A cough from someone next to you can make you feel reassured, but it can also remind you that life can be fragile. When you sleep, it feels like you're taking a risk, but it also feels like you are being relieved. And it wasn't just human enemies. There are lots of stories about creatures of the dark. Trolls, drug addicts, and spirits were said to walk around at night, pressing on the chests of sleepers and making their dreams into nightmares. In sagas, whole households wake up in terror after being visited by something. Were these ghost stories just metaphors for smoke-filled hallucinations? Or did the Vikings really think that they could be attacked in their sleep? Historians don't agree on this, but the large number of such stories suggests that they had a big effect on people's nighttime imagination. Strangely, the smoke might have made things worse. Modern studies of smoke inhalation show that it can disrupt sleep, cause shallow breathing, and can lead to vivid dreams or hallucinations. I was lying in a smoky longhouse, coughing and my eyes were stinging. The line between nightmare and reality blurred. A shadow in the rafters could easily become a ghost. If you have a dream where you feel like you can't breathe, it might feel like someone is sitting on your chest. Night fear was built from both Saras and real-life smoky experiences. One strange thing that was found at an old farm in Iceland was the remains of heavy doors and locking mechanisms. Even in very remote villages, families would make sure they were very safe at night. Some scholars think this was more about stealing animals than murder. The message is the same. Doors were more than just ways to keep the cold out. They were also a way to keep the heat in. They were used to protect people from intruders. If you bolted the hall at night, it was a sign that you didn't trust the world outside. Think about how this makes you feel. Every night, she had to balance two truths. You needed to sleep, but you couldn't fully relax. Parents lie awake, listening out for their children's breathing and for the storm outside. Warriors held their swords tightly, even under their blankets. Old women used to say special words to keep bad spirits away. He quietly prayed that dawn would come without disturbance. People shared a bed, but they also shared their fears. Experts still disagree about how much fear of raids had an impact on Viking society. Some people think that this made the people of the island tough. They think that this meant that they were always ready for a fight. Others say it helps people work together. Families who slept close to each other and trusted one another were more closely bound together by the fact that they were all vulnerable. Both of these may be true, and both help to explain why Vikings were so loyal and fierce. So, as you lie again in your imagined straw bed, you feel this contradiction. One side is warm, the other side is cold. The fire glows. Your family's close by, but you still look for sounds in the dark. In the Viking Longhouse, sleep was more than just rest. It was about being brave and closing your eyes in a world where danger was all around you, and every morning was a sign that you had survived the night. The flames gently flicker, and while everyone around you is breathing in sync, another layer of Viking night falls. Despite the warm furs and fire, the Longhouse was also a place where sickness spread quickly. People had smoke in their lungs, pests crawling on their bedding, and dozens of people sharing the same air night after night. In this closed-off world, sleep and illness went together. The evidence we have from archaeology makes us think very carefully. Viking skeletons show signs of long-term breathing problems. The ribs are bent because of constant coughing, lungs marked by years of breathing and soot. Living in a smoky hall meant that frostbite was not a problem, but it also meant that the air was rarely clean. Try to imagine what it would be like to try to fall asleep when you have a lot of mucus in your chest and you keep coughing and waking yourself up every hour. A child wheezing in the corner wasn't a rare tragedy. It was the nightly background of life. It is well known that houses with turf roofs tend to be quite humid. Moisture seeped through, clinging to wood and bedding. In such dampness, illnesses spread quickly. Scientists in Iceland have found old mold in turf. This shows that the walls might have become less healthy. You roll onto your straw mattress and realize that there are other problems. It's the tiny organisms like fungi and bacteria that are too small to see, and they're drifting around in the smoky dark. And then there's a slightly strange but funny story. Lice themselves may have spread disease. Some researchers think that diseases like typhus could have spread in these crowded halls, passed from person to person during nightly scratching sessions. Imagine a family trying to get rid of lice by the light of a fire, throwing them into the flames, without realizing that they might also be throwing away disease. The same warmth that made people feel close also made them want to copy each other. Scientists are still discussing how many people die from living in longhouses. Some people say that these health risks were always there, but could be managed, and that people's strong immune systems and herbal remedies made things better. Others say that the longhouse environment was very bad, making people die younger and causing many children to die. The evidence doesn't give us simple answers, only suggestions of a delicate balance between survival and suffering. Now, let your senses experience this version of a hall. The smoke smells so bad that it makes your eyes water. Someone nearby coughs loudly, their body shaking as they are covered in furs. Another one is restless with fever and muttering in delirium. The straw beneath you is damp from sweat and the air tastes sour. You feel uneasy, knowing that one sick body can spread infection through the entire hall very quickly. But families had ways to deal with these problems. Viking-age texts mention herbs like yarrow, juniper, and angelica that were used to treat ailments. A woman might scatter herbs in bedding to make it smell nice, or burn juniper as incense to clear bad smells. Did it help? Maybe only in their minds, but even the act of sprinkling herbs gave them hope. And in a hall full of smoke and fleas, hope was like another kind of warmth. One strange archaeological find in York revealed that latrine deposits were full of parasite eggs. Vikings often had roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworms in their stomachs. Imagine lying in the smoky hall. You feel a sort of stomach pain, but it's not from hunger. It's from parasites moving around inside you. Sleep must have been shallow, broken by cramps and discomfort. The Longhouse was more than just a place to stay. It was also where diseases were first found. But people kept going. Sleep wasn't perfect, but it was enough. A child coughed and got stronger. A mother itched and still rose before dawn to tend a fire. A man wheezed loudly through the night, but still went out to see what was happening. They were very resilient. Scholars are still trying to work out how the Vikings understood these illnesses. Did they think it was smoke, or did they think it was ghosts causing coughs and fevers? Some sagas suggest the latter, with sickness described as curses or as trials from the gods, but others hint at a more practical understanding. Houses that were too smoky made people ill, so air vents were adjusted and bedding was changed. The line between superstition and observation became blurred in the daily hustle and bustle. Now, think about the emotional rhythm. Parents worried about sick children pressed together for warmth. Elders say prayers while coughing themselves to sleep. Neighbors were whispering in the dark. They were discussing whether illness meant bad spirits or just bad air. It was a struggle to survive. They had to deal with the cold and disease. You can almost hear it now, the loud noise of snoring and coughing. Some of them are sharp, some of them are wet, and some of them linger like shadows. The sound tells the truth. This hall is not just full of life. It is full of sickness. But families still stick together and share warmth, herbs, and hope. You put your cloak back on and breathe in the smoky air that makes your throat hurt. You realize that comfort and sickness go together here. The same walls that protect you can also hold you back. The same warmth that sustains you can also cause fever. In the Viking Longhouse, sleep was never simple rest. It was a very dangerous situation. He fought against frost and disease every night. The hall is very cold and empty. But tonight, you think less about smoke and straw and more about what this place means beyond just survival. The Longhouse is more than just a place to live. It is the center of Viking society, where everyone slept together every night as a family or in a community. Resting here meant joining in with a rhythm that was older than anyone could remember. Firelight, bodies touching, and the never-ending struggle between cold and warmth. Sleep wasn't just a personal thing. It was a cultural thing. Experts who study old buildings have noticed that longhouses were almost always at the center of villages. They were bigger and stronger than other buildings. They were status symbols, yes, but they also helped people feel more connected to each other. When you imagine lying on your bench, it isn't just a bed. It's a place that's important to the community. Your position, your neighbors, and even your bedding all showed who you were. People who were closer to the hearth were thought of as having a higher status. The meaning of by the door is lower. Hierarchy didn't end when people died. It stretched right into the smoky dark. One detail that is well known comes from reconstructions. A longhouse was more than just a place to live. It was a building that had many uses. It was a barn, a workshop, a place for feasting, and a bedroom. This meant that sleep was never on its own. As you lay in straw, someone else sharpened a tool over a fire. A woman spun wool by the light of a lamp. A child coughed. An animal moved in its stall. Rest is a part of life, not something separate from it. Here's an interesting point. Some sagas describe arguments about who gets to sleep where, as if benches were something to fight over. People argued about where to sit, whether it was warm enough, and whose cloak was the longest. Imagine arguing at night about who had the best spot. Voices got louder even as others tried to fall asleep. It's like something out of a funny movie, with the same sounds of fighting you heard earlier when they were making big promises. Experts are still discussing whether these nightly arrangements had a big effect on identity. Did growing up with close relatives make the family more loyal, or did it make them resentful and competitive? Some experts who study people and society, anthropologists, think that the Viking world's focus on family and promises made to each other showed what they had learned from being trusted as children, when they would all sleep in the same bed. Others say that stories of feuds show that people can be just as hostile in close spaces. The evidence can't decide, but you can feel the truth of both as you roll over, bumping into your cousin's elbow. Now, pause and picture the sensory mix of culture and sleep. The sound of the fire is also the rhythm of storytelling. The itch of straw is also the texture of shared labor, harvest turned into bedding. The smell of smoke is also the scent of ritual that connects gods, hearth, and ancestors. Even resting becomes a cultural activity. Every sigh, snore, and whispered prayer is part of a bigger feeling of connection. One interesting discovery in Iceland showed that longhouses were gradually made longer over time. This means that the sleeping platforms also grew, with families stretching out like living organisms. Imagine lying in a hall where your grandparents once slept, and your children will soon be lying beside you. The idea of continuity of place made sleeping feel like a small part of a much bigger story, like a thread in a tapestry that shows different generations. Each night's sleep was important for the whole day. It was just what had been happening for hundreds of years. It is interesting to note that later stories suggest that where you slept can affect your personality. A child who always slept near the door, so they were always getting a bit of wind, was thought to grow up to be strong and healthy. One who always stayed near the fire became lazy and weak. Was this just superstition? Maybe, but it shows how important sleep was to Viking culture and how it was connected to their beliefs about morality. Scientists are still trying to work out what these nightly rituals mean. Some people think of them as practical, everyday things like fire, furs, and benches. Others say they were also symbolic, shaping who people thought they were, what they believed, and the community. When you combine evidence from archaeology, sagas, and folklore, you get a richer picture. Sleep was important for survival, but also for status and spirituality. Now feel it one more time. You lie on your straw mat, cloak pulled high, child pressed against your side. The fire is smoldering. Goats can be heard breathing softly behind the partition. A cousin is snoring at your feet. It isn't peaceful by today's standards, but it is very human. They experienced everything together, tested their bonds, and survived every night. The Longhouse was more than just a building. It was a sculpture made of wood and wool. I spent every night somewhere between sleeping and waking up. As you close your eyes again, you realize that you're not just imagining how Vikings slept. You're trying to imagine what their lives were like. You can't separate the two. For them, rest was very important. It was about survival, community, identity, and continuity. All of these were very important in the smoky, dark hall. The night is starting to feel very long, and as you lie there half awake, you start to understand what Viking sleep is like. You felt the smoke sting your eyes, the straw scratch your skin, and the furs felt heavy on your chest. You have shared breath with children, pressed knees against relatives, listened to goats shifting in the dark, and whispered prayers into the smoke. Sleeping in a Viking longhouse meant giving in to exhaustion and accepting the whole way of life, culture, and beliefs of the Vikings. Experts who study the past, archaeologists and historians, are putting together pieces of bone, wood, and old stories. This shows us a world where no detail was wasted. A cloak could also be used as a blanket. A goat was also used as a heater. A fire was also used to honor a spirit. Bedding wasn't just about comfort. It was a survival toolkit. It's made up of whatever materials a household can find. Straw refreshed with ash. Wool cloaks. People traded hides and feathers from faraway places for goods and money. Every night was different, combining human warmth, animal presence, and spiritual trust. One thing that is clear is that sleeping was a natural part of life. The Longhouse was not a separate bedroom. It was a place where people lived, worked, talked, prayed, and slept. You never escaped other people. A cough might wake the hall. A story might spread through the rafters. A dog's growl might make people reach for weapons. Privacy, silence, and calm. These are modern illusions. The Viking night was thick, multi-layered, and full of life. And then there's the strange part. Fleas jumping across fur. Snoring caused by alcohol vibrating through the benches. Children squirming. Raiders sometimes barging through the door. It wasn't calm. It was messy, noisy, itchy, and still. People rested because rest wasn't perfection. It was enough. Survival wasn't about having a comfortable life. It was very demanding. Scientists still can't agree on whether people slept well or not. Some people say that splitting up the rest into 2 or 3 parts helped families deal with the work of looking after the fire and the noise. Others suggest that sleep was not deep and was often interrupted, which would have left the Vikings feeling tired all the time. We may never know the truth, but the fact that their world continues to exist is proof of one thing. They got a little sleep, but it kept them going through long trips, busy times in the fields, and wars. Now close your eyes and imagine you are in a hall. The benches are full of people. The fire is hidden under a layer of ash. A cow quietly breathes out in its stall. Beside you, a child twitches in a dream, and your partner pulls the cloak tighter around both of you. You are wrapped in a fragile but sufficient layer of warmth. Above you, smoke hides gods and spirits like a second ceiling. Every detail is uncomfortable, but every detail is also important for survival. The Viking Longhouse was more than just a building. It was a ship that only sailed at night, carrying families through storms of frost and darkness. Its walls were made from hulls, its rafters from masts, and its benches from bunks. If, by morning, there were still embers glowing and someone was breathing, then the journey through the night had been successful. And so you drift into the last dream of this journey, realizing that the Vikings didn't defeat winter with luxury. They beat it by being close together, being clever, and being very stubborn. Each night's sleep was a win. Every morning, I saw that the system, which was not perfect, smoky, and crowded, worked well enough to keep life going. And now, as the story ends, let the Longhouse disappear. Let the smoke go up into the sky. The fire becomes ash. The bodies move as the gray light of dawn seeps through the cracks in the roof. You've experienced every stage of Viking sleep. The straw, the cloaks, the furs, the coughing, the snores, the warmth of children pressed close. The swords are always ready. You've heard Saras whisper, felt pests crawl, seen embers stirred by ash. It was never quiet, never clean, never easy, but that was life. Now, relax and get comfortable. Your room might be quiet, your bed might be much softer, and the air might be much clearer than the smoky air of a turf roof hall, but remember the lesson from that distant world. Rest doesn't have to be perfect. It needs enough warmth, enough closeness, enough faith that the night will pass and the morning will come. The Vikings were much more frugal than you are now, and yet they had dreams. They woke up, they built things, they sailed. So, as your body becomes still, let yourself feel the same surrender. You won't feel the cold here. The shadows are just that, shadows. You can rest assured that your warmth will be kept safe until morning. Breathe slowly, relax your body and mind, and let the past disappear into silence. Sleep well, traveler. The night gently carries you, and morning always comes.